Have you ever stood before a grand estate and wondered what stories remain hidden behind its walls, waiting for someone to notice the traces of sacrifice that shaped its creation? Welcome to Historic Docs Archive, dear listener. Share where and when you are joining us, and feel free to subscribe as we begin this gentle journey into the past together. The quiet evening light settles gently over the slopes of the Blue Ridge Mountains, turning the distant ridges into long, soft silhouettes that seem to drift toward the horizon. As the light fades, the Biltmore Estate stands in the foreground like a vast stone vessel resting on a green sea, its tall chimneys and steep roofs outlined against the deepening sky. Visitors who make the journey today often pause to admire that first sight of the house, a place many describe as almost unreal in its scale and beauty. But when we begin this long story together, it helps to imagine the estate not as it looks now, but as it once appeared before a single stone was laid. The land that would one day hold the largest private home in America was rugged and heavily worn by earlier decades of farming and logging. In the late 19th century, more than 1,000 people still lived, scattered across the hills and valleys that George Washington Vanderbilt would eventually purchase. Small cabins, simple farmhouses, and modest barns dotted the clearings. Narrow paths led through thickets of laurel and rhododendron. And while the soil had been depleted in many areas, these mountains had been home for generations to families whose lives were woven into the ridges, fields, and creeks. To understand the beginning of Biltmore, we must first step back a few years before its construction, to a moment far from North Carolina, in a setting of wealth, refinement, and quiet summer comfort on the Rhode Island coast. In the summer of 1892, an event occurred that would shape George Vanderbilt's ambitions and fears more deeply than anything else in his early adulthood. That event was a fire at his brother's grand home in Newport, the first version of the mansion known as the Breakers. Homes of the Vanderbilts were known for extravagance, but they were also known for their modern conveniences. The Newport house was filled with gas lights, heavy draperies, and ornate furnishings, all symbols of the family's social position. But the combination of gas lighting and early electrical wiring created dangerous conditions. On a quiet summer day, a fire began in the servants' wing of the house. Within minutes, smoke traveled through corridors, and flames began consuming the upper floors. Members of the Vanderbilt family escaped in time, but 3 servants did not. Their names were recorded in news reports of the day, but their stories faded quickly in the shadow of larger events. For George Vanderbilt, who was visiting his family that summer, the memory of the loss left a deep and lasting impression. The tragedy revealed something that many wealthy families of the time rarely considered. Behind the beauty and luxury of their homes, there were people who worked long hours, lived in the upper levels or basement quarters, and faced risks that were often unseen by the public. The fire made clear that even the most modern grand homes could be vulnerable. As the flames destroyed the Newport mansion, George stood among the stunned onlookers as firefighters struggled to control the blaze. He watched as thick smoke billowed into the night sky and glowing embers drifted across the nearby lawns and gardens. The idea that a splendid house could disappear in a matter of hours left him unsettled. He was a quiet, thoughtful man, known for his love of learning and his fascination with architecture and culture. But after that night in Newport, his interest in building a home of his own began to take on a new shape. He wanted a place of beauty, but he also wanted a place of safety, permanence, and technological excellence. This moment is important because it helps us understand the mindset George carried with him as he traveled through the American South and looked for a site where he might establish a new kind of estate. The Vanderbilt fortune had allowed him to explore widely and travel internationally, and he often sought quiet, restorative places where he could read, walk, and enjoy long periods of solitude. In the late 1880s, George visited western North Carolina and was captivated by the natural landscape. The mountains were cooler and more temperate than the lowlands. The views opened wide toward distant ridges, creating a sense of peace he found nowhere else. These mountains seemed like a place where he could build not just a home, but a personal retreat shaped by art, nature, and science. He imagined an estate with cultivated gardens, managed forests, and a house that would stand as a testament to craftsmanship and innovation. But when he began purchasing land in the region, he was not acquiring wilderness untouched by human presence. He was buying parcels that belonged to families who had long built their lives among these hills. Some lived in small cabins near creeks, some kept orchards or a few livestock. Formerly enslaved families had established homes in the years after the Civil War, often on marginal land where they built communities, churches, and traditions. White settlers had farmed the rough soil for decades, working fields that were vulnerable to erosion. Many of these families struggled against poverty, but their connection to the land was deep. George's agents offered to buy large sections from those willing to sell, and while some accepted with relief, grateful for cash that could support a move to better opportunities, others felt a sense of loss as the land around them changed hands. The legal transactions were straightforward, but the emotional landscape was more complex. Leaving behind a family cemetery or a homestead built by one's parents or grandparents was not easy, and in some cases, graves remained behind on land that would later be incorporated into the estate. These early years of land acquisition formed the quiet beginning of what would become a vast property of more than 100,000 acres. This part of the story often fades in public memory because the later achievements of Biltmore, its architecture, its gardens, its innovations, tend to overshadow the experiences of those who lived there before the estate existed. Yet the record shows that George Vanderbilt was not indifferent to the land or its people. He believed that the worn slopes of the region could be restored through careful management. He invited some of the most forward-thinking environmental minds of the period to study the property. Among them was Gifford Pinchot, who would later become the first chief of the United States Forest Service. But long before Biltmore became associated with scientific forestry, it was a place where families had passed down stories around fireplaces, walked narrow trails to Sunday services, and tended crops in fields carved out of the hills. When George gazed across the mountains, he saw opportunity. When local families saw the same landscape, many saw their history. As the estate began to take shape, the contrast between the grand vision forming in George's mind and the quieter, older world around him became more visible. Surveyors marked boundaries. Workers widened paths into roads. Trees were cut to prepare areas for construction. And even as George sought to improve the land, the people who once called those places home were moving elsewhere, some to nearby farms, others to mill towns or cities. What remained behind were traces of their lives: a forgotten orchard tree, bent and aged but still bearing fruit, stone foundations sinking into moss, hand-built fences leaning in the grass, small overgrown cemeteries with simple markers, their inscriptions weathered by rain and wind. These places did not disappear overnight. They faded quietly as new plans rose around them. Through this lens, we can begin to approach the birth of Biltmore with clearer eyes. It was the result of vision, wealth, and determination, but also the product of choices that altered the lives of many others. It was created in the hope of harmony between architecture and nature, yet its creation first required the transformation of a landscape already shaped by human hands. Understanding this balance between ambition and impact helps us see Biltmore not only as a house, but as a chapter in the story of the region itself. As the last light leaves the evening sky over the mountains, imagine the land as it appeared in the final years before construction began. Rolling hills touched by the soft movement of wind, fields dotted with the remains of split-rail fences, thin smoke rising from the chimneys of a few remaining cabins, and behind all of it the quiet expectation that a grand and unfamiliar future was approaching. A future that would reshape everything built there before, leaving only faint echoes of the world that once stood hidden beneath the shadows of the ridges. The faint outline of those fading cabins and drifting chimney smoke becomes the doorway into the next chapter of this long story, a reminder that the creation of Biltmore began not with stone or steel, but with an idea formed far from the mountains themselves. As the image of the quiet slopes dissolves, we return to the eastern seaboard, where George Vanderbilt carried with him the memory of the Newport fire, a memory that had settled deeply into his thinking. That night in Rhode Island, with its sudden flames and desperate evacuations, left him with a sense of vulnerability no amount of wealth could fully erase. The loss of life, especially the servants whose names were barely recorded, had revealed the fragility of even the grandest houses. As George considered building a home of his own, he knew he wanted a place that could withstand danger, a house made not only of beauty and comfort, but of solid protection. The idea of fireproof construction became an early and unwavering priority, shaping nearly every decision that followed. This private anxiety, born from a single catastrophic night, would eventually influence the design of every hallway, every chimney, and every hidden service room in the house he dreamed of creating. In the years after the Newport fire, George spent more time traveling through Europe, where he visited historic chateaus and admired the union of artistry and engineering in those centuries-old structures. He studied how thick stone walls survived generations of storms, conflicts, and accidents. He observed the way European builders combined ancient methods with modern innovations. But he also knew that transplanting such architecture to the hills of North Carolina would require more than admiration. It would demand an architect capable of merging old-world craftsmanship with the latest advancements in American building technology. George eventually turned to Richard Morris Hunt, one of the most respected architects of the time, known for his training at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Hunt had designed mansions for many members of the Vanderbilt family, but none as ambitious as the project George now placed before him. When George began describing his vision, an immense chateau inspired by the great houses of France, adapted for American landscapes and constructed with almost total fire resistance, Hunt recognized the scope of what he was being asked to create. It was not a house. It was an engineering challenge on a scale rarely attempted in the nation. Hunt was cautious at first, recognizing the financial and logistical strain such a project would impose. The land was remote. The terrain was rugged. Skilled craftsmen would need to be brought from distant cities or even overseas. Materials had to be transported up steep slopes where rail lines did not yet exist. But George, in his steady and quiet way, insisted that these challenges only made the project more worthy. He trusted Hunt completely and agreed to the architect's insistence on uninterrupted authority during the construction process. With this agreement in place, the planning for Biltmore began in earnest. Hunt assembled teams of draftsmen, engineers, and supervisors. They spent months producing drawings that detailed every angle, every window, every tower. The plans called for a steel framework to support the house, an innovation that would significantly reduce fire risk, covered by vast quantities of Indiana limestone. Beneath the elegance of the facade, the structure would rely on the same industrial principles used in modern factories and train stations, giving it a hidden resilience no European chateau possessed. While Hunt and his team worked in their New York offices, preparations on the land in North Carolina grew more visible. Roads were widened to accommodate heavy wagons. Temporary housing was arranged for workers who would soon arrive by the hundreds. And though local residents had known the land was changing hands, it was only when the first survey flags appeared across the hillsides that the scale of the coming transformation became clear. Those who had remained on nearby farms watched as engineers hammered stakes into the ground and marked elevations along the ridges. The presence of so many new faces, contractors, foremen, teamsters, stonecutters, signaled the beginning of a construction period that would stretch on for years and reshape the very character of the region. To meet the demands of such a project, a temporary railroad spur was constructed from the main rail line into the estate. This single decision reflected the enormous scale of the undertaking. Limestone had to be shipped by rail from quarries in Indiana. Bricks arrived by the tens of thousands. Timber and steel beams needed to be moved quickly and efficiently. Without the railroad spur, the timeline would have stretched indefinitely, and the cost would have spiraled even higher. The presence of the railroad also meant that workers and craftsmen from cities such as New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago could travel to the estate with relative ease. Some came for the promise of steady wages. Others came for the rare opportunity to work on a project of historic scale. As the first trainloads of materials reached the estate, the earliest foundations were dug into the red clay earth. The foundation trenches revealed the geological character of the land: layers of stone, pockets of clay, and soil that had been shaped for generations by farming. Workers labored with shovels, picks, and early steam-powered equipment. They grappled with the unpredictability of weather in the mountains, enduring cold winds in winter and heavy storms in summer. In those early months, the site bore little resemblance to the grand house it would become. It looked instead like a vast excavation, a landscape of trenches and rising walls where workers moved steadily among piles of stone and timber. One of the first visible signs of progress was the arrival of the limestone blocks. These large, heavy pieces were carefully unloaded from rail cars and hauled by teams of horses and mules to the construction site. Each block was carved and shaped by hand, using chisels and mallets, often by craftsmen who had learned their trade in Europe. Their work required precision and patience. The slightest error in shaping a stone could disrupt the alignment of the facade. Day after day, the sound of chisels tapping against the stone echoed across the hills, mingling with the distant murmur of creaks and the steady rhythm of saws cutting timber. The early walls began to rise slowly, forming the outline of the house that would eventually stand as an icon of American architecture. The workers who were part of this massive effort represented a mix of backgrounds and experiences. Some were skilled masons who had spent years on construction sites in major eastern cities. Others were local laborers familiar with the tough conditions of mountain work. Many lived in Brick Village, a community built specifically to house the workers and their families during the years of construction. This small village had rows of brick houses, a school, and basic services, creating a temporary settlement that became a world of its own. For the children who grew up there, the sight of the rising mansion became an everyday backdrop, a structure so vast that it seemed to belong to another world entirely. But behind the determination and progress lay the hazards of construction that were part of daily life. Workers balanced on scaffolding several stories high. They handled heavy blocks with ropes and pulleys. They transported dynamite to clear rocky sections of ground. Injuries were common, and although a small hospital was established on the estate to treat the wounded, not all could be saved. While precise records are lost, the combination of height, explosives, primitive safety measures, and sheer manpower suggests that several workers lost their lives during the construction years. Their graves, often unmarked, became part of the hidden history of the estate, overshadowed by the grandeur of the house they helped build. As winter storms passed and spring returned, the rising walls became more defined. Towers and chimneys grew taller, forming the silhouette of the house long before the interior took shape. From a distance, the structure looked like a medieval fortress emerging from the forest. But up close, it was a hive of activity. Teams of workers installed steel beams, hammered nails into wooden frames, and carried materials up ladders and across narrow walkways. The construction site was alive with motion, noise, and purpose. And as the exterior stonework approached completion, the attention began to shift toward the interior spaces where George Vanderbilt hoped to create rooms filled with art, books, and comforts rarely seen in American homes. Yet even as the house grew, it remained anchored to the memory of the world that came before it. The empty fields, the abandoned cabins, and the small cemeteries that had once defined the landscape. The mansion did not erase the past, but its presence changed the meaning of everything around it. The land that once sheltered families now became the foundation for a structure built to endure for centuries, a structure that would symbolize both human ambition and the quiet costs carried forward from earlier lives. The towers rising slowly from the forested ridge become the bridge into this next chapter, standing unfinished against the mountain light as the work within the house grows more complex. Those stone walls, now firmly in place, marked only the beginning. What happened inside them would determine whether Biltmore became the refugee George Vanderbilt imagined or remained a hollow shell of ambition. As interior work began, the atmosphere on the estate shifted. The ringing of chisels on limestone gave way to the steady thud of hammers, the rasp of saws cutting through oak and walnut, and the faint metallic clatter of pipes, wires, and ducts being maneuvered into position. The house was no longer simply a grand exterior. It was becoming a labyrinth of systems, corridors, and chambers that needed to operate flawlessly if Biltmore were to function as a living home. Richard Morris Hunt's architectural drawings, once just ink on paper, were now translated into real spaces. Rooms began to take shape in long succession. The vast banquet hall, the soaring library, the winter garden filled with light, and the service corridor stretching deep into the building's hidden heart. The craftsmanship required to complete these spaces was immense. Woodworkers carved decorative panels with care. Plasterers shaped intricate ceiling details with the patience of sculptors. Paint crews worked through the night in some rooms so that other teams could enter at dawn to begin the next stage. Every surface demanded attention, from the marble floors polished until they gleamed to the ornate mantels imported from Europe and carefully installed beneath towering chimneys. Yet the beauty that visitors admire today was only one part of the immense effort unfolding. The unseen life of the house required just as much skill, if not more. Behind the walls, an intricate network of pipes carried water to bathrooms on multiple floors, a luxury still rare in American homes of the era. Steam radiators linked to large basement boilers promised consistent heat throughout the winter. Electric wiring extended through the house in a system that mixed the familiar with the experimental, since electricity was still a relatively new domestic technology. To guard against fire, ducts and flues were arranged with unusual precision, and the steel frame, hidden beneath stone and plaster, gave the house a structural fire resistance that George Vanderbilt believed was essential. Workers labored in cramped spaces to secure pipes, wrap joints, and test electrical lines. The temperature inside the unfinished house varied sharply. At times, it was cold enough to see breath forming in the air. At others, the heat from the boilers or the strain of physical labor left men sweating as they carried materials through narrow passages. The work demanded stamina and caution. Any mistake in plumbing or electrical installation could jeopardize the systems meant to make the house safe. It was not uncommon for foremen to pace the corridors late into the evening, checking alignment, testing valves, and inspecting the newest additions inch by inch. Meanwhile, outside the house, the estate itself was changing. Roads that once wound unevenly through the hills were widened, repositioned, and bordered by retaining walls. Bridges were built across streams, and the early outlines of the gardens were marked by George Vanderbilt's chosen landscape architect, Frederick Law Olmsted. His designs were broad in scope and required years of preparation. Hillsides were cleared of underbrush, new saplings were planted, and pathways were shaped with long-term vision. Even as construction crews focused on stone and timber, teams working under Olmsted tended to the land with the same care and planning that would shape the estate for centuries. Within the house, progress advanced room by room. Some spaces appeared almost ready, furnished with tapestries, paintings, and rugs that George had collected during his extensive travels. Others remained incomplete, filled with scattered tools, stacks of lumber, or crates waiting to be opened. The contrast created an unusual atmosphere. In one hallway, the scent of fresh oak mingled with the faint smell of plaster dust, while in another, a finished room offered a glimpse of what the house would one day fully become. Workers began to realize the magnitude of what they were creating. Many had participated in large projects before, but few had seen a private home of such ambition. By late 1895, pressure mounted to complete enough of the house for the planned family gathering at Christmas. The deadline, set long before construction reached its final stages, did not bend easily. Although Hunt and his teams did everything they could to accelerate the work, it became clear that not all rooms would be ready. Still, George was determined to welcome his family for the holiday. The mansion would open its doors, whether fully completed or not. Workers hurried to finish essential rooms. Rugs were unrolled. Art was hung with careful hands. Chandeliers were lowered for last-minute adjustments, cleaned, and then lifted once more toward the ceiling. As the day approached, the house hummed with activity. Steam filled basement corridors where boilers fired for the first time in extended use. Electric lights flickered and steadied as engineers tested the system under the strain of full illumination. Carpenter crews carried ladders from room to room, making final corrections. In the kitchen, staff prepared to work at a level no one in the region had attempted. Ingredients arrived from nearby farms or were brought in by train. The air crackled with expectation, but also with uncertainty. On the morning of Christmas Eve, the landscape around Biltmore glistened with frost. Workers made final adjustments inside the house, while servants polished silver and arranged floral displays. When the Vanderbilt family arrived, their first view was of a house alive with light, warmth, and promise. But as the hours passed, the strain on the new systems began to appear. Steam pipes hissed unexpectedly. Some rooms grew too warm, while others remained chilly. The electrical circuits, though advanced for their time, showed inconsistency under the load. Servants hurried through hallways, making quiet corrections where they could. Despite these challenges, the gathering continued, its success carried by the beauty of the rooms that had been completed, the hospitality of the household, and the sense of wonder the house inspired. Yet beneath the surface, issues lingered. The mansion functioned, but not quite seamlessly. Pressure valves needed adjustment, wiring required reinforcement, and certain areas needed further work before they could be used comfortably. But George accepted these imperfections. He knew this first season was more of a beginning than an arrival. Over the following months and years, improvements would continue quietly until the systems ran with greater efficiency. The house had opened its doors, and though not entirely finished, it had begun its life as a home that would eventually welcome countless visitors. As the holiday gathering came to an end and family members departed through the cold winter air, the house settled into an unfamiliar silence. Only the soft ticking of cooling pipes and the distant clatter of tools in unfinished rooms disturbed the calm. Outside, the frost-covered hills reflected the pale light of morning. The work of building Biltmore had not ended. It had only entered its next stage, one that required not stone or steel, but human endurance, organization, and daily labor to bring order to a house of unprecedented scale. And in that quiet moment, just as the last carriage rolled down the long driveway, the winter sun cast a faint glow through the high windows, illuminating dust in the air. The house seemed to breathe after its first true test, holding within it both the promise of comfort and the weight of the effort still required to make it fully whole. The faint glow drifting through those high windows lingers as we move forward, settling gently on the quiet corridors where the servants would soon begin their morning routines. That soft winter light touched not only the finished rooms, but also the hidden network of hallways and staircases behind them, places where the rhythm of life at Biltmore depended on people whose names were rarely written down. As the house shifted from the excitement of holiday festivities to the steady demands of daily operation, the true test of its design and its staff began, for the grandeur that surrounded guests required an entire world of unseen work to keep it functioning smoothly, and that work fell to the many individuals who lived behind the scenes. The household, still new and adjusting to its scale, operated with a structure borrowed from the grand estates of Europe. At its center was a division between the visible and the invisible. Guests would pass through rooms illuminated by chandeliers and warmed by towering stone fireplaces, while just beyond the walls, servants moved quickly through narrow corridors, ensuring that every detail appeared effortless. The complexity of the house made their tasks unusually challenging. There were fireplaces to tend, linens to launder, floors to clean, meals to prepare, and dozens of guest rooms requiring attention even when unoccupied. The servants had to learn the geography of the house as though it were a small city, memorizing each staircase and service passage until the path from kitchen to dining hall or from laundry room to guest wing became second nature. Still, no amount of training could fully prepare them for the scale of Biltmore. Many of the workers came from local families who had never seen a structure so vast. Their previous experience might have involved modest mansions or inns, but nothing matched the complexity of this estate. They navigated rooms of extraordinary size, staircases that twisted through multiple levels, and storage spaces that seemed endless. Some of the younger staff recalled feeling lost during their first weeks, wandering briefly before finding the correct hallway or workroom. It took time for the house to become familiar, and until it did, each day brought both routine and uncertainty. The leadership within the household played a vital role in easing that transition. The butler, responsible for overseeing the male servants and managing much of the daily order, approached his duties with practiced composure. He coordinated meals, supervised the dining arrangements, and ensured that guests received attentive but unobtrusive service. The housekeeper, equally essential, directed the female staff, organizing cleaning schedules, managing linens, and addressing issues of housekeeping that required immediate attention. Both roles demanded not only skill, but patience, for training a new staff under such conditions required calm guidance and a steady hand. Beyond their internal hierarchy, the servants also faced challenges emerging from the house itself. The first months after the holiday gathering revealed inconsistencies in several of the newly installed systems. While repairs were underway, servants had to adapt to rooms whose temperatures were unpredictable or areas where plumbing remained unreliable. They often worked long hours to correct issues quickly so that guests would never see the strain beneath the surface. The pride they took in maintaining the illusion of seamless comfort reflected a quiet dedication to the house that grew with each passing week. Life beyond the mansion walls added to their experience. Many servants lived on the estate, either in staff quarters within the house or in cottages built nearby. These residences provided modest comfort, but allowed the household to function efficiently. Meals were taken at specific hours, and time off, though limited, gave them brief moments of rest. Some attended small gatherings or visited nearby Asheville when schedules allowed, seeking connection with friends or relatives beyond the estate. Yet for many, Biltmore became their primary world, a place where daily routines shaped the flow of their lives. The vastness of the estate ensured that work extended far beyond the mansion. Groundskeepers tended miles of pathways, gardens, and lawns. Stable hands cared for horses, required for transportation around the property. Cooks worked in the large basement kitchens, preparing meals not only for the family, but for the entire staff. Teams responsible for maintenance inspected heating pipes, electrical systems, and the machinery that supported the daily operation of the estate. Each of these roles required expertise and discipline, for a lapse in one department could ripple through the others, disrupting the harmony that George Vanderbilt hoped to maintain. Despite these structured routines, tension began to grow quietly among the staff. Some servants felt that their responsibilities exceeded what they had expected when they accepted their positions. Others believed that the promises made during hiring regarding hours, workload, or accommodations were not being fulfilled as consistently as they should have been. The size of the estate placed unique pressure on the workers. Maintaining comfort for the family and their guests was a constant demand, and the effort required could be taxing. These concerns remained unspoken for a time, whispered occasionally in corners or noted privately between the staff. The hierarchy within the household, with clear divisions between upper and lower servants, sometimes deepened these frustrations. Those in more senior positions enjoyed more comfortable quarters and lighter duties, while the workers responsible for cleaning, carrying, or maintaining the physical needs of the house often pushed themselves to exhaustion. This imbalance, though common in large estates, felt particularly pronounced in a house of this magnitude. As winter gradually shifted towards spring, the early enthusiasm of settling into a new home began to mingle with the quiet strain of long hours. The house required constant attention, and despite its beauty, its operation relied on the strength and endurance of those working behind the scenes. Their efforts were essential, yet much of their work remained invisible, acknowledged only when something went wrong. And as the weeks unfolded, the small frustrations that had gone unnoticed began to gather weight. One evening, after a particularly demanding day, the servants gathered in their quarters, the air filled with a tired stillness. The lamps flickered softly as conversations drifted between them. Concerns about fairness, hours, and broken promises surfaced again, but with a new sense of urgency. It was becoming clear that something had to change, not just for the sake of comfort, but for the well-being of those whose labor sustained the estate. The quiet voices in the servants' hall, filled with a mixture of fatigue and determination, signaled the beginning of a tension that would grow in the months ahead. And as the lamps dimmed and the house settled once more into silence, one question lingered softly in the mind of more than one servant. How long could they continue under these conditions before their patience reached its limit? The question that lingered in those dimly lit servants' quarters, quiet yet persistent, carries us now into the next chapter, where the rising unrest begins to take shape beneath the daily routines of the house. That moment of stillness after a long day, when tired voices finally gave shape to unspoken frustrations, marked a turning point in the life of the estate. It revealed the early signs of tension that could no longer be eased by polite reassurances or brief moments of rest. The vast mansion, beautiful and imposing, required unending effort to sustain, and the weight of that effort fell heavily on the people whose work remained unseen. As the months unfolded, the murmurs that began as quiet conversations would slowly grow into a collective resolve that neither George Vanderbilt nor his household management could ignore. The changing seasons heightened these pressures. Spring brought more guests, more requests, and more expectations for seamless hospitality. Each arrival meant additional fires to be tended, more rooms to prepare, and more hours spent accommodating the desires of visitors unaccustomed to the challenges of maintaining such a large home. The schedule tightened, especially for lower servants who had to respond quickly to every task, no matter how small. Their days began before dawn and stretched long into the night, guided by an unspoken demand for precision and constant readiness. Even simple duties became more demanding within the walls of Biltmore. Preparing rooms meant climbing multiple staircases with heavy linens and supplies, often crossing great distances in the process. Serving meals required coordination between kitchen staff and dining room attendants, all moving quietly through service corridors that formed a complex network beneath the grand rooms above. When unexpected events arose, such as a spill on an ornate carpet or a malfunctioning light fixture, servants were expected to resolve the issue immediately, preserving the unbroken image of order that characterized the estate. For some, the strain was manageable. Experienced staff, particularly those who had worked in large homes before, accepted these demands with practiced endurance, but others struggled, especially those new to service or those who had lived simpler lives before joining the household. Many came from families once living on the surrounding land, people whose lives had changed dramatically when George Vanderbilt acquired the acreage. They were determined, but the unfamiliar pace and expectations of the estate tested their limits. The division between upper and lower servants contributed further to the growing discontent. The upper servants, including the butler, housekeeper, and senior kitchen staff, maintained authority over the daily operations. They received better accommodations, more predictable schedules, and the respect that came with managerial roles. Their responsibility was significant, but they were sheltered from the physical exhaustion that defined the work of the lower servants. This hierarchy, long established in traditional households, functioned smoothly in many homes. Yet in an estate as large as Biltmore, its impact was magnified. The disparities felt wider, the tensions sharper. Gradually, small signs of discontent began to appear. A housemaid hesitated before taking on yet another task at the end of a long shift. A footman lingered in the corridor, rubbing sore shoulders after carrying trays up multiple flights of stairs. A kitchen worker spent a moment longer than usual leaning against a counter, gathering strength before returning to her duties. These brief pauses, barely noticeable at first, reflected a deeper strain that could not continue indefinitely. The leadership within the household sensed the tension, but viewed it through the lens of long-standing tradition. The butler, trained to enforce order, expected obedience and punctuality, believing that structure would resolve any unease. The housekeeper, though practical and often sympathetic, still upheld the standards required by the estate. Neither recognized that the house, with its immense scale and complex systems, demanded more from the staff than the traditional household model could reasonably support. As the months passed, small complaints soon found a voice in informal gatherings among the servants. During rare moments of rest, conversation shifted from mild grumbling to more direct expressions of fatigue and disappointment. Promised time off was often withheld due to unexpected demands. Some rooms in the servants' quarters lacked sufficient heat, especially during cold mountain nights. In certain cases, the cost of damaged items, even when the damage occurred through unavoidable accidents, was deducted from already modest wages. These issues, taken individually, might be manageable. Together, they formed a pattern that weighed heavily on those who kept the house running. Among the staff was a young woman who became a quiet catalyst for change. Her experience in other grand homes had given her a sense of what fair treatment could look like, and she recognized that certain conditions at Biltmore, though unintentional, placed undue burden on those with the least stability. She carried these concerns not with defiance, but with a steady conviction that adjustments were necessary for the well-being of the entire household. Gradually, others began to confide in her, and their collective concerns formed the basis for a more unified sense of purpose. The atmosphere in the servants' quarters shifted. While duties continued as usual during the day, the evenings took on a more contemplative tone. Servants gathered quietly, speaking in low voices so as not to disturb the rest of the household. They discussed their workloads, the missed hours of rest, and the growing sense that their efforts were not fully recognized. Yet even as they expressed these concerns, there was no hostility. Their intent was not rebellion for its own sake, but a hope for fairness and balance in a demanding environment. As spring matured into summer, the estate entered a season of increased activity. The gardens flourished, guests filled the house, and the daily routines grew even more demanding. The beauty of the estate seemed to contrast sharply with the exhaustion felt by those who tended it. The growing heat made certain tasks more difficult, particularly in the kitchens and service corridors where ventilation was limited. Still, the servants continued their duties, driven by discipline, loyalty, or necessity. Yet beneath the surface, the quiet resolve that had begun as simple conversation strengthened. Servants who once hesitated to speak up now found courage in their shared experiences. They understood that if change was to occur, it would require unity, caution, and careful planning. No single person could risk approaching the management alone, but a collective voice might encourage a different response. As the season unfolded, the tension reached a quiet but unmistakable threshold. The servants knew that the time for speaking privately among themselves was nearing an end. They would soon have to decide whether to present their concerns formally. The weight of that decision carried through their conversations, through the long hours of work, and through the stillness of night in the servants' quarters. And just as the summer light settled gently over the estate, filling the corridors with a muted warmth, the question they had held in their hearts returned with renewed clarity. How long could the household continue as it was before the quiet strain grew into something that demanded to be addressed? The question that settled over the household with quiet persistence, returning again and again in moments of fatigue and reflection, becomes the thread that guides us into the next chapter. It lingered through long evenings and early mornings, weaving itself into the rhythm of daily work until it could no longer be dismissed as a passing discomfort. By the time summer deepened over the estate and the days grew warm and unforgiving, this question had become a shared understanding among the servants. Something had to change, and as their resolve strengthened, the atmosphere within Biltmore shifted in ways that even those in the grandest rooms could sense, though they did not yet understand what was coming. The servants continued their duties with practiced discipline, but beneath the surface, quiet determination replaced silent resignation. Their daily routines maintained the familiar structure of the household, yet the strain of long hours, limited rest, and unmet expectations pressed on them with greater weight. The estate, beautiful and serene from the vantage point of its visitors, held within its walls a growing tension that only those behind the scenes could truly feel. What began as informal murmurs in the servants' quarters gradually took the shape of a unified intention, the beginnings of a conversation that would soon move beyond whispers. The catalyst for this turning point was not a dramatic event, but rather a series of small moments that accumulated until action felt inevitable. A kitchen worker fainted one afternoon from the heat rising off the large stoves, collapsing quietly before being helped to her feet by her colleagues. A young housemaid, tasked with rushing trays from the kitchen to the dining room, slipped on a polished corridor floor and bruised her shoulder badly. A footman, exhausted after attending to guests far into the night, overslept by a few minutes and was reprimanded sharply. Each incident alone might have passed unnoticed or been resolved with an apology, but together they captured the physical and emotional cost of maintaining a household as demanding as Biltmore. It was in this climate that the servants began meeting more formally, gathering quietly at the end of their shifts in one of the lower rooms of the estate. The space was small, lit by a single lamp, and often still warm from the day's lingering heat. The servants would sit on simple chairs or lean against the walls, their posture reflecting the fatigue that had accumulated over weeks of work. The air carried the scent of starch from freshly laundered linens, faint traces of soap, and the smell of wood warmed by the long day. In this modest room, they discussed the challenges they faced, speaking with a sincerity shaped by necessity rather than rebellion. Their concerns were clear and practical. The promise of regular time off had not been met consistently, often overridden by the needs of guests or unexpected household demands. The servants' quarters, particularly those located near the less ventilated sections of the estate, lacked sufficient heating in winter and adequate cooling in summer. The practice of deducting wages for accidental damage, a policy carried over from older traditions, placed undue burden on staff already receiving modest pay, and above all, the sheer scale of the estate created physical demands that surpassed what many had experienced in previous positions. Despite these difficulties, the conversations remained grounded in respect. The servants admired the beauty of the estate and took pride in their role in maintaining it. Their request was not for leniency, but for fairness. They believed that adjustments could be made without compromising the standards of the household, and that such changes would strengthen the estate's operations rather than weaken them. As discussions continued, the servants decided that their concerns needed to be presented formally. They debated the best approach, whether to speak directly with the butler and housekeeper, or whether their message should go straight to George Vanderbilt himself. The hierarchy of the household made this decision delicate. Directly approaching the owner of the estate could be seen as bypassing management, but speaking with the butler alone might result in their concerns being dismissed before reaching the person who could effect meaningful change. Ultimately, they chose a balanced approach, to draft a letter expressing their concerns respectfully and clearly, one that could be shared with both management and, if necessary, with George Vanderbilt. The letter was written collectively, one quiet evening after the majority of the household had gone to sleep. Several servants offered their ideas, with one among them skilled in writing, putting their thoughts into measured words. The tone of the letter was calm and formal, acknowledging the honor of serving in such a remarkable home while outlining the practical issues affecting their ability to work effectively. They requested more reliable time off, improved conditions in the servants' quarters, and reconsideration of the wage deductions for accidental damages. The letter emphasized that these concerns were raised not out of defiance, but out of a desire to maintain the high standards expected of them without unreasonable strain. When the letter was complete, it was folded carefully and entrusted to one of the more experienced servants, who agreed to deliver it to the butler at an appropriate moment. That moment came the following morning. The butler received the letter with a mixture of surprise and concern. He read it slowly, his expression tightening as he absorbed the contents. While he understood the challenges of managing such a large household, he also recognized that certain issues were beyond his authority to resolve. After a brief consideration, he decided that the matter needed to be brought to George Vanderbilt's attention, if only to ensure transparency and avoid escalation. The household entered a period of quiet anticipation as they waited for the response. Days passed, filled with the usual demands, yet the servants carried themselves with a quiet sense of unity. Their work continued, but now with a shared awareness that their concerns had been voiced respectfully and collectively. The uncertainty of how their request would be received remained, but the simple act of speaking as one had already shifted the atmosphere of the estate. Finally, word came that George Vanderbilt wished to meet with representatives from among the servants. This news traveled quickly through the staff, stirring a mixture of apprehension and cautious hope. The chosen representatives were instructed to gather in the library, a room known for its tall shelves and soft light filtered through large windows. When they entered the space, they were met by the sight of George, sitting quietly, his demeanor composed and attentive. He invited them to speak, and for the first time, a direct conversation began between the owner of the house and those responsible for its daily care. The meeting unfolded with measured calm. The servants spoke respectfully, explaining their concerns and offering suggestions for improvement. George listened intently, asking occasional questions, seeking to understand the practical realities of their work. Though he had always envisioned Biltmore as a place of harmony and beauty, he had not fully grasped the physical toll required to maintain such an estate. The conversation illuminated complexities he had not considered, and it marked the beginning of a shift in how the household would be managed. As the meeting concluded and the servants left the library, they walked quietly down the long corridor, carrying with them a sense of cautious optimism. George had not offered immediate solutions, but he had listened. And in a house built from dreams and determination, sometimes being heard was the first step toward meaningful change. Outside, the late summer light settled gently over the hills surrounding the estate, casting long shadows across the lawns. Within that changing light lay the promise of adjustments yet to come, born not from confrontation, but from collective resolve. The late summer light that settled across the estate after that quiet meeting in the library becomes our passage into the next chapter, its long shadows stretching gently toward the house as if signaling that something subtle but significant had shifted within. The servants who walked out of that room carried with them not triumph, but a rare sense of acknowledgement. For the first time, their concerns had been spoken aloud in the presence of the estate's owner, and though no immediate changes had been promised, the very act of listening had altered the atmosphere of Biltmore in a way that everyone could feel. Still, the path from listening to action was long, and the challenges that lay ahead would reveal just how complex it could be to transform a house of such ambition into a place of sustainable balance. In the days that followed the meeting, the household resumed its ordinary routines. Breakfast trays were prepared before dawn. Fires were tended in rooms that remained cool in the early morning hours. Hallways were polished, guest rooms refreshed, linens folded, and meals coordinated with the precision that guided the estate's daily life. But beneath the surface of this familiar rhythm, a quiet uncertainty took hold. The servants wondered how George Vanderbilt would respond once he had considered their words fully. Management, too, felt the weight of this question. The butler and housekeeper carried themselves with heightened attentiveness, aware that the concerns raised reflected not only individual frustrations, but the structural challenges of running a household the size of a palace. George, for his part, approached the matter with the same thoughtful deliberation he brought to every aspect of his estate. He reviewed the letter again. He consulted with the butler, listened to the housekeeper's perspective, and reflected on the complexities of maintaining such an expansive property. Biltmore had been designed with innovation in mind, yet its human dimension, its reliance on skilled labor, emotional endurance, and personal sacrifice, was more demanding than he had fully understood. He recognized that changes were necessary, but determining which adjustments were feasible required careful thought, for he was balancing not only the servants' needs, but also the expectations of guests, the traditions of estate culture, and the delicate operations of the household's many systems. As late summer gave way to early autumn, George began to implement quiet, incremental changes. They were not announced formally, nor were they communicated with fanfare. Rather, they appeared gradually, emerging first in the servants' quarters. Additional coal was provided to improve heating during colder nights. Windows that had long been difficult to open were repaired to improve airflow. Worn bedding was replaced, and lighting was adjusted in areas that had been too dim for comfort. These were small improvements, yet they signaled that the concerns raised had not been forgotten. At the same time, George asked the butler and housekeeper to monitor workloads more closely. Certain tasks were redistributed to reduce strain, and days off were enforced with greater consistency. Though this did not eliminate the long hours required to maintain the estate, it added a measure of predictability to schedules, allowing servants moments of rest they had previously lacked. The practice of deducting wages for accidental damage was reconsidered, and while not abolished entirely, it became more flexible, reserving deductions only for repeated incidents rather than single mistakes. These adjustments improved daily life, but they did not quell all the unrest. The household was large and not all needs could be addressed immediately. Some servants felt that the changes, while appreciated, did not go far enough. Others believed that patience was necessary, trusting that further improvements would follow. The tension that had once reached a quiet breaking point now softened into a cautious hope, though it remained threaded with uncertainty. Even George acknowledged privately that his efforts were only the beginning. Managing a home of this magnitude was a continuous process, evolving with experience and shaped by the realities of each passing season. Autumn brought the estate a different kind of energy. The mountains surrounding Biltmore transformed into a tapestry of deep reds, golds, and soft browns. The air grew cool enough to require steady fires in the house once more. With the change in season came new guests, drawn by the beauty of the region and the prestige of visiting such an extraordinary home. Their presence increased the workload again, yet the servants, buoyed somewhat by recent improvements, moved with renewed steadiness. Still, the underlying complexity of the estate's operations ensured that challenges remained. One of the most demanding areas was the laundry. The sheer quantity of linens required for a home of this size was immense. Every sheet, towel, tablecloth, napkin, and garment had to be washed, dried, ironed, and stored with precision. The work was repetitive and physically taxing, involving long hours in rooms warmed by industrial boilers. Despite the recent improvements, these conditions remained difficult. The women who worked in this department often ended their shifts with sore shoulders and tired hands, yet they carried on with quiet resilience, aware of how essential their contributions were to the smooth running of the estate. Similarly, the kitchen staff faced intense daily demands. Preparing meals for the family, staff, and guests required constant coordination, especially during large gatherings. The kitchen was a world unto itself, filled with heat, noise, and movement. Large stoves radiated warmth that grew oppressive during long shifts. Pots simmered, ovens baked, and cooks navigated the space with an instinctive awareness developed through repetition. They prepared elaborate dishes inspired by European cuisine, alongside more traditional Southern meals that reflected the region's heritage. Though the pace was exhausting, the skills honed in these kitchens became a point of pride for many workers. Even as improvement slowly took shape, the estate remained an environment defined by contrasts. The grandeur experienced by guests stood in stark contrast with the labor required to sustain it. Staff moved through hidden hallways, hearing faint echoes of conversations and music from the rooms above, yet rarely participating in the life unfolding there. Their world was one of constant motion, shaped by duties that demanded both physical endurance and emotional composure. And while the small adjustments implemented by George Vanderbilt marked a shift toward greater consideration, the servants still felt the lingering weight of expectations that could not simply be lifted with a few changes. As the days shortened and the light took on the softer quality of approaching winter, the servants found themselves reflecting on the months that had passed since their meeting with George. Some took comfort in the progress made. Others remained cautious, recognizing that the estate's demands would rise again with the holiday season. The uncertainty that had once filled the servants' quarters remained, though now it mingled with a sense of guarded optimism. One evening, as a cold wind moved through the hills surrounding the estate, a group of servants gathered quietly in the same small room where they had once drafted their letter. The window panes trembled faintly in the breeze, and the lamp beside them cast soft shadows across the walls. They spoke in calm tones, acknowledging the improvements, but also considering the challenges that still lay ahead. Winter at Biltmore was beautiful, but it was also demanding, and the coming months would test their endurance once more. As they rose to return to their duties, the wind outside intensified, brushing against the house with a low, steady sound. And it was that sound, soft yet persistent, that carried with them into the next stage of their lives at the estate, a reminder that even in a place built for beauty, the forces of nature and human effort shaped each day in ways both seen and unseen. The low, steady sound of the wind brushing against the walls of the great house becomes the doorway into the next chapter, a reminder that every season brought new demands to the people who lived and worked within Biltmore's vast boundaries. That same wind, whispering along window panes and stirring the branches of the distant trees, signaled the coming of winter, a season both beautiful and unforgiving in the mountains of North Carolina. For the servants, winter meant a renewed intensity of labor. For the estate itself, it meant a shift in rhythm as the landscape quieted and attention turned inward toward warmth, preparation, and endurance. As autumn faded and the first hints of frost appeared on morning grasses, the estate entered a period of preparation that touched almost every aspect of its operation. The gardens, once vibrant with seasonal color, were pruned and protected. Groundskeepers secured young trees against winter winds, cleared pathways, and inspected drainage channels to ensure that runoff from melting snow would not damage the carefully shaped terrain. Inside the walls of Biltmore, the staff prepared the house for the cold, checking fireplaces, laying out heavier linens, polishing brass fixtures that would soon feel the warmth of winter fires, and inspecting the steam heating system that played a crucial role during the coldest months. The heating system, advanced for its time, required constant attention. Deep within the basement, a team of engineers managed the boilers that fed warmth through the miles of pipes extending into nearly every room of the estate. These men often worked unseen, their tasks carried out in rooms filled with the hum of metal and the steady pulse of machinery. The heat from the boilers made their workspace intensely warm even on the coldest days, and maintaining consistent temperatures throughout the house required vigilance. A slight change in pressure or an unnoticed leak could cause chilly rooms far above, creating discomfort for guests and additional work for the household staff. The servants who tended the fireplaces faced demanding schedules as well. With dozens of hearths throughout the home, they began their rounds before dawn, carrying kindling through narrow service corridors and coaxing flames to life in rooms that needed warmth before the household woke. Their work continued throughout the day, ensuring that fires did not burn too low or smolder unevenly. The weight of coal buckets and wood bundles grew heavier as the season deepened, yet they moved with steady purpose, accustomed to the physical demands of their roles. Winter also brought an increase in indoor gatherings, dinners, and social visits. Guests traveled to Biltmore to enjoy its elegance in the mountain setting, expecting comfort regardless of the weather outside. For the kitchen staff, this meant preparing meals that were warm, hearty, and often elaborate. The kitchen, already warm in summer, became a place of intense heat during winter. Large pots simmered constantly, ovens baked continuously, and the air filled with rich scents. Roasting meats, fresh bread, and slow-cooked vegetables blended into an atmosphere that was both nourishing and exhausting for the cooks who labored there. In other parts of the house, the winter months placed increased strain on laundry staff. Heavy blankets, thick drapes, and layered linens required more time to wash and dry. The steam rising from basins and drying racks filled the laundry rooms with a humid heat that clung to the air. Workers wiped sweat from their foreheads, even as cold winds brushed against the windows behind them, a contrast that defined the season for many. Amid these physical demands, the emotional atmosphere among the servants continued to evolve. The small improvements implemented during the autumn had provided comfort, yet life at Biltmore remained demanding. Long hours continued, and while schedules were more predictable than before, the relentlessness of winter labor tested the resilience of the staff once again. For some, the holiday season brought joy. They found moments of quiet satisfaction in preparing the house for celebrations, decorating halls, arranging wreaths, and assisting in the creation of an atmosphere that visitors found enchanting. For others, the season intensified feelings of isolation, especially for those far from their families. Yet even in the hardest moments, small gestures of kindness created bonds among the servants. A shared cup of tea at the end of a long shift, a quiet word of encouragement, or a moment of laughter amid the bustle strengthened the sense of community that had been growing since their collective decision to voice their concerns. The servants had learned to rely on one another, not only for support in their tasks, but for emotional balance in a place where the demands could easily overwhelm. Meanwhile, George Vanderbilt continued to observe the estate with careful attention. He recognized the significance of the coming winter, understanding that the season would reveal whether the adjustments made so far had meaningfully improved daily life for the staff. He met regularly with the butler and housekeeper, asking measured questions about workloads, rest periods, and the condition of the servants' quarters. His respect for the workers deepened as he saw firsthand the effort required to maintain the estate through harsh weather. Though the changes he implemented were gradual, they reflected a growing awareness of the human cost woven into the beauty of the home he had built. Despite these thoughtful efforts, the estate's immense scale continued to pose challenges. A winter storm, sweeping unexpectedly across the mountains one evening, brought heavy snow and biting cold that tested every part of the estate's operation. Roads leading to the property became difficult to navigate. Workers responsible for tending fires found themselves moving more quickly to keep rooms warm. Engineers in the basement worked late into the night to maintain steady pressure in the heating system, the machinery groaning under the strain of continuous use. The house, for all its grandeur, was no match for the forces of nature without the constant labor of those who kept it running. During that storm, a subtle but meaningful shift occurred within the household. As the wind howled outside and snow continued to fall through the night, servants gathered in their quarters once their duties were complete. The atmosphere was quiet, softened by fatigue and the distant whistle of winter air against the stone walls. Yet there was a sense of shared solidity, a recognition that their work, though demanding, was not unnoticed, not unvalued. The meeting with George, the incremental improvements, and the continued conversations within the household had fostered an environment where workers felt for the first time that their voices mattered. As the storm gradually subsided and pale morning light revealed a landscape blanketed in white, the servants prepared for another demanding day. They rose before dawn, stepping into the cold corridors with steady resolve. The snow outside softened the world, but inside work continued with the same careful, deliberate rhythm that had guided the estate since its first winter. And it was that sight, the fresh snow lying quietly over the hills, untouched and gleaming in the early light, that carried them into the next stage of the season, a reminder of both the beauty that defined the estate and the unseen labor required to sustain it day after day. The sight of fresh snow lying quietly over the hills, untouched and gleaming in the early morning light, becomes our threshold into the next chapter. That still whiteness, serene and undisturbed, held within it a deceptive calm. For while the landscape appeared softened and silent, the demands inside the house only intensified. Winter at Biltmore was a season of beauty, but for those who kept the estate running, it was also a season of unbroken effort. The snow outside reminded them of nature's quiet power, while the warmth inside depended entirely on human hands and human endurance. As the storm passed and clear days returned, the estate settled into its winter rhythm. Guests continued to arrive, stepping from chilled carriages into the welcoming heat of the grand entrance hall. They marveled at the holiday decorations, the towering tree, the polished surfaces that reflected firelight, and the atmosphere of comfort that George Vanderbilt took pride in offering. Yet behind every impression of luxury was the careful orchestration of dozens of people working with practiced precision. Servants rose early each morning, stepping into cold corridors long before the household stirred. They checked fires, prepared breakfasts, and navigated the hidden passageways that connected their world to the one inhabited by the Vanderbilt family and their distinguished visitors. One of the greatest challenges of the season was the maintenance of the steam heating system, which now ran continuously. The boilers required constant attention, and the engineers responsible for them worked in long shifts, often in stifling heat. The sound of metal expanding under pressure, valves releasing bursts of steam, and the hum of machinery became a kind of winter heartbeat deep beneath the main floors. These engineers rarely saw the grand rooms above, yet they played an essential role in keeping them warm and welcoming. Their work was demanding and largely invisible, but without it, winter comfort in the house would have been impossible. In the upper floors, housemaids moved swiftly but quietly, shaking out rugs heavy from foot traffic, dusting surfaces that collected soot from the constant fires, and ensuring that guest rooms remained inviting despite the challenges of the season. The cold seeped through stone walls in certain areas, requiring extra care to maintain warmth. Rooms that were not in use had to be checked regularly to ensure that no unexpected drafts or temperature drops created issues for the house's delicate systems. It was a careful balance, maintaining comfort without wasting the immense heat needed to sustain such a large home. Meanwhile, the kitchens worked at full capacity. Winter meals required more preparation, longer cooking times, and an increased variety of ingredients. The cooks, scullery maids, and kitchen assistants found themselves surrounded by warmth and noise from dawn until well into the evening. Large kettles simmered continuously, ovens radiated heat, and the aroma of roasting meats and freshly baked bread filled the air. It was demanding work, but it carried its own rhythm, one that the staff learned to navigate with practiced skill. Coordination between those preparing the food and those serving it in the dining room was essential, and the narrow service hallways often echoed with the sound of footsteps as dish after dish was delivered with precise timing. Despite the demanding pace, winter brought moments of quiet beauty that the servants observed from the edges of their work. A flurry of snow visible through a small window in a service stairwell. The soft glow of candlelight spilling from the dining room into the corridor. A wreath placed carefully on a door, its evergreen branches still fragrant. These brief glimpses reminded them of the season's gentler side, even as their duties required constant movement and attention. Yet winter also amplified the lingering challenges that had sparked the servants' earlier concerns. Though improvements had been made to their quarters and schedules, the sheer intensity of winter work often left them exhausted by the end of each day. The long shifts of tending fires, managing laundry, and supporting the household through holiday gatherings placed considerable strain on many. Some workers developed persistent coughs from moving between extreme temperatures. Others experienced fatigue that deepened as the weeks went on. The unity that had formed among the staff remained strong, but it was now tested by the heaviness of the season. Still, the memory of being heard by George Vanderbilt continued to provide a steadying sense of purpose. They recognized that the changes made so far, though not transformative, were meaningful steps toward a more balanced environment, and they held on to the hope that once the winter demands eased, further adjustments might follow. For now, they focused on maintaining harmony in their work, supporting each other, and preserving the island of trust they had begun to build within the household. As the coldest days of winter settled over the mountains, the estate became a place of striking contrasts. Outside, the landscape lay quiet and still, its hills blanketed in white. Inside, the house pulsed with activity, from the warmth of the kitchens to the steady hum of the boilers and the soft sounds of servants moving through the hidden corridors. The interplay between visible elegance and invisible labor defined this season more clearly than any other. One evening, after a day of especially heavy snowfall, the servants gathered briefly in their common room once their duties were done. The windows revealed only darkness and drifting flakes outside, but within the room, the low light of a single lamp cast a calm glow. They spoke in tired but gentle tones, sharing moments from the day, offering small reassurances, and exchanging quiet laughter that warmed the space more effectively than the modest fire nearby. It was in these moments, simple, unremarkable, yet deeply human, that the true heart of the household lived. Later that night, as they returned to their rooms or prepared for the next shift, the wind outside began to soften. The snow continued to fall, but now with a slower, more delicate rhythm. And it was this sound, the faint whisper of snow settling against the stone walls, that carried through the corridors and quietly accompanied the estate into the deepest part of winter. By morning, the snowfall had transformed the grounds once again, leaving the landscape covered in a smooth blanket of white that stretched across fields, pathways, and rooftops. The servants rose before dawn, prepared themselves for another full day of effort, and stepped once more into the cold corridors that connected their world to the one guests admired so deeply. The snow outside still glistened with untouched beauty, but within the house, the cycle of work and endurance continued, guided now by a growing sense that change, though slow, was moving steadily forward, waiting for the moment when winter would loosen its grip and the season of renewal would begin again. The untouched snow that covered the estate in a smooth, unbroken layer becomes our quiet passage into the next chapter. Its stillness, resting gently across rooftops and fields, offered a momentary illusion of peace, a silence that contrasted sharply with the steady work unfolding inside the house. Yet beneath that glistening surface lay something deeper than winter calm. It marked a turning point, a pause before the landscape and the household entered another season of transition. As the days gradually lengthened and the cold began to soften, the estate braced itself for the slow return of spring, carrying with it both renewed hope and the weight of unresolved challenges. When the first hints of warmer air drifted through the valley, they brought a subtle shift that servants felt even before the guests did. The snow no longer stayed long on the ground. Icicles began to drip steadily from the edges of rooftops. The wind lost its sharp winter edge and carried instead the faint scent of damp earth, awakening beneath the melting frost. These changes, small as they were, signaled the beginning of an important seasonal transition, one that affected every corner of the estate. For the servants, the early spring weeks offered a mixture of relief and renewed pressure. The worst of the winter labor, tending constant fires, battling drafts, and managing heavy winter linens, began to ease, but in its place came the preparation for the spring season, which demanded a different kind of energy. Winter grime had to be removed from hallways and stairwells. Windows, streaked by icy winds, needed thorough cleaning. Heavy drapes were taken down, shaken out and stored, replaced by lighter fabrics that brightened the rooms as sunlight returned. The transition required endurance and attention, but it also carried the quiet reward of fresh air seeping through cracked windows and the sight of green returning to the distant hills. The groundskeepers were among the first to feel the pressure of spring's arrival. As the snow receded, it revealed fallen branches, washed-out paths, and areas where frost had shifted the soil. They cleared debris, repaired stone borders, and inspected young trees planted the previous year. The estate, designed with long-term vision, depended on careful stewardship during transitional seasons. Frederick Law Olmsted's plans had begun to take shape by now. Long, curving drives, meadows arranged with purpose, and woodland areas restored gradually from the effects of previous logging. Spring was the moment when the full intention behind his designs became visible again, and the workers carried out their tasks with a sense of responsibility to the landscape that extended far beyond their daily routines. Inside the mansion, the arrival of spring meant a shift in the household's rhythm. Guests traveled more frequently, drawn by the promise of warmer mountain air and the renewed beauty of the surrounding forests. The staff prepared for longer days, filled with more activities, more meals, and more movement throughout the house. The kitchen staff began adjusting menus to reflect seasonal ingredients, anticipating the produce that would later come from the estate's gardens and greenhouses. Florists on the estate gathered early blooms for arrangements placed in the main rooms, delicate reminders of the season's slow return. Yet even as spring offered relief from winter's burdens, it also brought back lingering questions among the servants. The improvements implemented during the previous months had helped ease their daily conditions, but some underlying issues persisted. Workloads remained heavy, and the sheer size of the estate continued to exert pressure on everyone. Though George Vanderbilt's willingness to listen had changed the tone within the household, the servants knew that lasting improvement required more than thoughtful conversation. It required structural adjustments, better distribution of duties, and ongoing recognition of their efforts. The conversations that had once filled the servants' quarters during winter continued quietly through spring, though now with a slightly different tone. Fatigue remained, but so did a cautious optimism. The staff had experienced for the first time the power of collective voice. They had seen that respectful communication could lead to meaningful, even if gradual, change. It created a sense of unity that endured now, even as new challenges emerged with the season. One of those challenges came from the estate's sheer growth. As the landscape developed and additional facilities were completed, the responsibilities of the servants expanded. New tasks were added to already full schedules. Certain staff members were reassigned to outdoor duties for seasonal work, leaving gaps inside the house that needed to be filled. Others found themselves navigating longer distances as the estate evolved, from the dairy and stables to the gardens and workshops. The coordination required to keep everything running smoothly increased, placing new demands on management and staff alike. George Vanderbilt, aware of these complexities, continued to observe the household with growing sensitivity. He met more frequently with the butler and housekeeper, asking for updates not only on tasks, but on the general well-being of the staff. He requested assessments of workloads and asked whether additional workers should be hired to ease the strain on existing servants. The estate had always been a project of personal passion for George, and he now understood more deeply that its success rested not only on architecture and land, but on the people who filled it with life. Slowly, spring deepened. The first leaves unfurled on the trees. Streams swollen by snowmelt sparkled under the growing warmth. Birds returned to the hillsides, their calls echoing across the grounds at dawn. These shifts brought a renewed sense of possibility to the estate, felt most clearly in the quiet moments between duties, when a servant paused near a window to see crocuses breaking through the soil, or when the gentle breeze carried the scent of rain instead of winter frost. But even as nature renewed itself, the estate's deeper challenges remained. The servants knew there was still work to be done if balance was to be achieved, if their lives were to reflect not just the patience of endurance, but the dignity of stability. The improvements of the past months had offered a foundation, but more conversations would be needed, more adjustments, and a clearer understanding from management of what daily labor truly required. One evening, after a day filled with spring cleaning and preparations for upcoming guests, several servants gathered once more in their common room. The windows were open slightly, allowing cool air to drift through the space. The scent of blossoming trees mingled with the faint smell of soap and wood polish on their clothes. They spoke quietly about the day's work, about the changes they hoped to see in the months ahead, and about the subtle but meaningful improvements that had already taken root. As they talked, the sound of a gentle spring rain began tapping softly against the windows. It was a calming sound, steady and delicate, filling the room with a sense of quiet reflection. That rain, falling evenly across the estate, felt like the beginning of something new, not dramatic or immediate, but steady, patient and promising. And it was the sound of that rain, the soft rhythmic tapping on the glass, that would carry them into the next season, into the next chapter of the estate's unfolding story, where renewal brought not only beauty, but deeper questions about growth, fairness, and the human cost woven through the grand design of Biltmore. The soft rhythmic tapping of spring rain on the windows becomes our gentle bridge into the next chapter, a reminder that renewal often begins not with sudden change, but with patient persistence. As the rain continued through the night, washing the last traces of winter from the stone paths and awakening the deep green of the surrounding hills, the estate itself seemed to take a quiet breath. Yet beneath this freshened landscape, deeper shifts were taking place, subtle movements in the life of the household, in the expectations placed upon the staff, and in the evolving understanding between those who served and those who owned the mansion's sweeping vision. As spring settled more firmly over the estate, the work required to prepare Biltmore for its busiest season intensified. Guests arrived more frequently, and with each arrival came renewed attention to hospitality and detail. The house's vast rooms, which had felt heavy with winter energy only weeks before, now needed to reflect the brightness of the season. Floors were polished until they shone. Windows were opened to allow fresh air to circulate through the long hallways. The winter drapes were replaced with lighter fabrics that allowed sunlight to filter softly into the rooms. Servants moved quickly and quietly through these spaces, ensuring that every corner reflected the elegance expected by the Vanderbilt family and their visitors. This period of transition placed new strain on the staff. Many had worked tirelessly through the winter, and now spring brought different but equally demanding tasks. The kitchens, shifting toward lighter seasonal menus, required ingredients that were often delicate and time-sensitive. The laundry staff found themselves managing linens in greater quantity as the household's activity increased. The groundskeepers, busy with early planting and repairs, worked long hours outdoors, shaping the landscape in accordance with Frederick Law Olmsted's detailed plans. Each department carried its own weight, yet all were bound together by the same sense of responsibility to the estate. Spring also brought a renewed influx of seasonal workers who were hired to assist with gardening, outdoor maintenance, and specialized preparations. Many came from nearby towns, bringing with them stories of the changing region, of farms adjusting to new economic realities, of families who had once lived on land now incorporated into the estate, and of communities reshaped by the presence of Biltmore. Their arrival added new voices to the daily rhythms of the estate and reminded the permanent staff of the wider world surrounding the mansion's carefully tended boundaries. As the days grew longer, George Vanderbilt continued observing the estate with thoughtful attention. Though the beauty of spring brought him satisfaction, he remained keenly aware of the complexities involved in maintaining such an expansive property. His earlier meetings with staff representatives had made a lasting impression. He recognized the sincerity behind their concerns and began to consider more permanent solutions to improve their working conditions. Yet these considerations unfolded slowly. The estate structure was intricate, and changes required careful planning to ensure they supported the long-term goals of the property without compromising its operations. During this period, George spent more time walking the grounds. He often paused near the gardens, noting the progress of new plantings or observing the steady work of those tending to the flower beds and pathways. He visited the stables, taking in the quiet sounds of horses being brushed and prepared for outings. He toured the newly constructed workshops where carpenters crafted and repaired items used throughout the house. These visits gave him a clearer sense of the estate's daily demands and a deeper appreciation for the people who bore them. Meanwhile, within the servants' quarters, the mood remained mixed. The improvements introduced earlier in the year had helped ease some concerns, but the increased demands of spring once again highlighted the estate's immense scale. Many workers moved through their days with diligence and quiet pride, motivated by their role in maintaining a home admired by visitors from across the country. Others struggled with the unpredictability of their schedules and the physical toll of their responsibilities. Yet, despite these challenges, a renewed sense of community among the staff provided steady support. It was during the height of spring preparations that an unexpected development tested the estate's newly delicate balance. One of the senior housemaids, known for her reliability and thoroughness, fell ill after weeks of overexertion. Her absence revealed how heavily the household relied on her precise and tireless work. Other servants stepped forward to fill the gap, taking on additional tasks to ensure that the household did not fall behind. Their willingness to support one another demonstrated the strength of the unity that had grown within the staff. Yet her illness also served as a reminder that even the most dedicated workers had limits, and that the estate's demands could push them to the edge of physical exhaustion. The situation did not go unnoticed. The housekeeper, concerned for both the health of her staff and the operation of the household, reported the matter to George. It reinforced for him the importance of continuing the work of improving staff conditions and ensuring that workloads were managed more evenly. George requested a detailed overview of each department's responsibilities, along with suggestions for staffing adjustments. It became clear that additional workers were needed, not only for seasonal assistance, but to support the permanent staff whose responsibilities grew with each year of the estate's expansion. While these reviews took place, life at Biltmore continued with its characteristic blend of beauty and labor. The gardens burst into full bloom, the forests surrounding the property filled with birdsong. Guests strolled along the pathways, admiring the carefully curated landscapes without ever seeing the hours of work required to sustain them. Inside the house, servants continued their duties with the steady efficiency learned from months of practice, even as they navigated the uncertainties of change. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the lawns, a small group of servants gathered near an open window to catch a cool breeze. Outside, the scent of early blossoms carried on the air. Inside, the familiar sounds of the household echoed softly, distant laughter from guests, the clink of dishes from the kitchens, and the muffled steps of workers moving through the service corridors. It was in moments like these that the servants felt the stark contrast between their world and the one they upheld. Yet they also felt a growing sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. A vast estate built not only from stone and timber, but from their collective effort, patience, and resilience. As evening settled and the light outside shifted to a soft blue, the distant sound of rain began again, gentler this time, tapping lightly against the roof and windows. That rain, falling steadily yet calmly, marked the end of another long day and the beginning of a night filled with quiet reflection. It carried with it the promise of continued renewal, the slow unfolding of change, and the enduring strength of those who kept the estate alive. And it was the delicate rhythm of that rain, falling softly over the blooming gardens and along the hidden corners of the servants' quarters, that would lead the estate into the next chapter, one where the arrival of summer would bring its own set of challenges, expectations, and opportunities for growth. The delicate rhythm of that rain falling softly over the blooming gardens becomes our quiet doorway into the next chapter, its gentle sound marking the final moments of spring before the weight of summer began to gather along the ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains. As the rain tapered into a fine mist and then finally into stillness, the estate emerged washed and renewed, its lawns bright, its pathways darkened with moisture, and the air tinged with the scent of wet earth and opening blossoms. It was a peaceful transition on the surface, but for those who worked within Biltmore's walls, it signaled the approach of another demanding season, one shaped by heat, increased guests, and the continued evolution of the estate's daily rhythms. Summer arrived gradually, with warm breezes that turned heavy and humid by midday. The mornings began earlier now, with pale light seeping into the eastern windows before most of the household stirred. Servants accustomed to winter's deep darkness now found themselves rising to a sky already touched with gold. The change was welcome, but it also meant more hours of visible activity for the household. The estate came alive with visitors eager to explore the grounds, take carriage rides, or enjoy long afternoons on shaded terraces. And with their presence came a new intensity of work for the staff who tended to every detail of their stay. The heat of summer placed unique demands on the estate's operations. The grand rooms with their high ceilings and thick stone walls remained cool for much of the day, but the service corridors and workspaces behind them often became warm and stifling. The kitchen, already a place of constant motion, grew hotter as ovens and stoves operated from sunrise to sunset. Pots simmered continuously, the air thick with steam, and workers moved with increased caution, their faces flushed from the relentless heat. In the laundry rooms, the combination of warm weather and steam from the drying linens created an environment that tested even the most seasoned workers. Yet the servants carried on with practiced efficiency, knowing that the smooth operation of the estate depended on their endurance. The groundskeepers faced their own challenges. Summer storms arrived suddenly, sometimes without warning, bringing heavy rain that flooded low-lying areas and washed soil from the slopes. After each storm, the workers inspected the grounds carefully, clearing debris, repairing damage, and ensuring the safety of pathways that guests used daily. The gardens, though breathtaking during this season, required constant care. Flowers wilted quickly in the heat, and shrubs needed careful watering to prevent them from drying in the sun. The estate's organizing vision, its sweeping lawns, reflective pools, and rolling meadows, depended not on the ease of nature, but on the continued dedication of the people who shaped it daily. Inside the house, summer brought a different kind of pressure. The increase in guests meant more rooms to prepare, more meals to serve, and more frequent gatherings. The housemaids worked endless cycles of tidying, dusting, and refreshing rooms, made stuffy by closed windows and heavy draperies. The butler coordinated a schedule that often expanded beyond the usual hours, ensuring that every guest felt attended to, regardless of the time. Footmen carried trays through warm corridors, delivering refreshments to rooms overlooking the gardens. Every task required calm precision, even when exhaustion pressed quietly at the edges of their patience. Yet amid the challenges, there was also a newfound steadiness in the staff's collective spirit. The unity that had grown during the previous months continued to guide them. Though the demands of summer were great, the changes implemented earlier in the year had begun to show lasting effects. Schedules were more balanced, and additional workers hired for busy seasons helped lighten the load in certain departments. The sense of being heard, truly heard, by the estate's owner still lingered among them, offering reassurance even during the most exhausting days. Still, the season was not without its moments of strain. One of the footmen, who had worked tirelessly through the summer heat, collapsed late one afternoon while carrying a heavy tray through one of the service corridors. The other servants rushed to help him, easing him onto a bench and bringing cool water from the kitchen. His collapse was not the first incident brought on by the heat, but it was the most visible reminder of the toll that the season could take. The housekeeper, upon learning of the incident, notified George Vanderbilt, who responded with both concern and frustration. Frustration not directed at the servants, but at himself for not anticipating the full impact of the seasonal demands. George took the event seriously. He ordered additional measures to protect the staff from the worst of the summer heat: improved ventilation in the service corridors, additional breaks during the hottest hours of the day, and temporary shifts in duties when certain workers showed signs of exhaustion. These changes did not eliminate the challenges of summer, but they offered relief and demonstrated that the estate's owner was learning, slowly and thoughtfully, how to balance ambition with the human realities required to sustain it. Meanwhile, the estate itself continued to evolve. Construction and expansion projects that had been on hold during the winter resumed. Carpenters worked on outbuildings, painters refreshed areas exposed to the elements, and teams continued shaping the elaborate gardens that would define the estate for decades. Each addition, each improvement, added to the overall beauty of Biltmore while also adding new layers of responsibility for the workers who kept it all running. Despite the intensity of their work, the servants found moments of rest in unexpected places. A brief pause near an open window allowed them to feel a soft summer breeze. A few seconds standing in the shade before returning to outdoor tasks offered coolness that settled on their skin like a calming touch. The sound of cicadas, humming in the trees during late afternoons, created a rhythm that blended with the pulse of the estate. Even the occasional rumble of distant thunder brought a sense of relief, promising rain that would cool the land, if only for a short while. One evening, after a long, hot day filled with preparations for a large dinner gathering, several servants stepped outside to catch their breath. They stood near the service entrance, the sky above them turning a deep shade of violet as the sun sank behind the mountains. Fireflies had begun to appear, their soft flicker moving gently through the grass. For a moment, the servants stood silently, letting the stillness of the evening wash over them. It was a rare pause, a moment when the demands of the day gave way to something softer, quieter, and deeply human. As night settled fully, the distant sound of crickets filled the air. The house behind them, still illuminated by warm interior lights, hummed with faint echoes of evening conversations. And it was that gentle blend of night sounds, the soft chorus of crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the muted hum of life within the mansion, that would lead the estate into the heart of summer, carrying with it both the weight of responsibility and the promise of continued resilience. The soft chorus of crickets that carried the estate into the heart of summer lingered through the night, filling the warm air with a steady, almost meditative rhythm. It was a sound that wrapped gently around the sprawling grounds, weaving itself into the stillness that settled over the estate after dusk. Yet beneath that calm, something else stirred, an unease that would soon rise quietly within the servant quarters as the season wore on. The peaceful night sounds created a fragile veil over a daily reality that was becoming harder for many workers to ignore. Summer at Biltmore was beautiful for visitors, But for those who lived and worked there every day, the unrelenting heat and the increased demands of the season pressed down with a force that was both physical and emotional. As the days stretched into long cycles of work, the servants began to feel the strain more deeply. Though improvements had been made over the previous year, and though George had shown a willingness to listen and adjust, there were limits to how much change could occur within an estate of this scale and complexity. The demands were simply too great, the expectations too high, and the structure too rigid to bend easily without cost. During midsummer, as the heat rose steadily each morning, the servants awoke already fatigued. Their quarters, though improved, retained the warmth of the afternoons long after sunset, leaving them restless through much of the night. By dawn, they returned to their duties with heavy limbs and slower steps, moving through hallways that seemed warmer each passing week. For some, these long days became an almost unbroken loop of repetition, cleaning, serving, preparing, adjusting, and returning to quiet rooms that offered only the simplest rest. The tension began with small murmurs. A housemaid mentioned to another that her promised time off had been canceled again due to a sudden influx of guests. A scullery worker noted that the kitchen staff had been working longer hours without relief. A footman whispered that the heat in certain service corridors had grown almost unbearable, despite attempts to increase ventilation. These were small frustrations, but they accumulated like layers of dust settling onto a shelf, barely noticeable at first, then suddenly heavy enough to reshape its balance. As the murmurs grew, they found unexpected resonance in the memories of the previous year. The servants had learned, almost by accident, that they held more power collectively than they had ever imagined. The near walkout had left a deep imprint on their understanding of their own value. It was not a dramatic shift. No one imagined themselves equal to the social power of the Vanderbilt household. But they knew now that the estate needed them, perhaps more than anyone had previously acknowledged. One afternoon, when the sun hung heavily over the estate and the air shimmered faintly above the stone terraces, an incident occurred that crystallized the simmering dissatisfaction. A young chambermaid fainted in one of the hallways due to the heat. She had been running errands between two upper floors, carrying linens and supplies. When she regained consciousness, surrounded by concerned servants, she apologized repeatedly, insisting that she had simply stood up too quickly. But everyone knew the truth. It was exhaustion, pure and simple. Word of the incident traveled quickly through the servants' quarters. For many, it felt like a turning point. The staff had been enduring long hours in difficult conditions for weeks, and the fainting of the young maid became a symbol of their collective strain. It was not anger that grew among them. It was a quiet sense of resolve, the same kind of resolve that had inspired the near revolt the previous year. They did not want conflict, but they wanted acknowledgement, respect, and a system that considered their well-being as carefully as the estate considered its guests. These sentiments reached the senior staff first. The housekeeper, a woman known for her steady leadership, listened carefully as workers approached her with concerns. She maintained a calm demeanor, but privately she recognized the growing tension. She remembered the unrest from months before and knew how swiftly a small issue could escalate into a larger one. The butler, too, sensed the shift. His position required strict adherence to the estate's standards, but he was not blind to the burden on his team. Finally, word reached George and Edith. They listened as the housekeeper described the difficulties: the heat, the long hours, the missed rest periods, and the emotional strain on the younger staff. To her credit, Edith responded swiftly. She understood the complexities of managing a large household better than anyone at the estate. She also understood that harmony within the staff was essential, not only for smooth operations, but for the long-term stability of the estate itself. The first changes she implemented were simple but meaningful. Additional breaks were scheduled during the hottest hours of the day. Buckets of cool water were placed strategically in hallways and work areas. Temporary staff were hired to alleviate some of the pressure in the busiest departments. A small but important shift in scheduling allowed some workers an earlier end to their day, when afternoon heat became unbearable. George, moved by concern, took steps of his own. He approved the installation of improved ventilation systems in some of the warmest corridors and ordered repairs to areas where airflow had become restricted. He also requested detailed reports on working conditions from department leaders, something he had not done proactively in the past. Though he did not always fully grasp the daily hardships of the staff, he showed genuine willingness to understand, and that willingness made a noticeable difference in the mood of the estate. The fainting of the chambermaid slowly faded into memory, replaced by an atmosphere of careful attention. Yet something deeper lingered beneath the improved conditions. The servants had become aware of their own importance, not through pride, but through necessity. They knew that the function of the estate relied entirely on their labor, and this realization shaped a quiet evolution in how they saw themselves. It did not change the core hierarchy of Biltmore. Those structures continued unchanged, but it fundamentally shifted the personal confidence of the people who sustained its daily life. As summer began its slow descent toward cooler nights and shorter days, the estate settled into a more balanced rhythm. The work remained demanding, but there was a renewed sense of cooperation between the servants and the family. The lessons of the season, like so many lessons learned at Biltmore, came quietly, shaped not by grand events but by the accumulation of small moments of exhaustion, resilience, adjustment, and understanding. And as the days grew just slightly more bearable, the crickets continued their steady chorus, leading the estate toward the next season with a sound that remained unchanged, even as so much else shifted beneath the surface. The steady chorus of crickets continued into the following nights, guiding the estate gently out of the height of summer and into a season that promised a different kind of rhythm. As the evenings grew marginally cooler and the fireflies appeared in fewer numbers, a subtle shift began to settle over the grounds. The intense heat no longer pressed as heavily on the workers, and the forested hills around the estate took on a deeper shade of green as they prepared for the slow transformation toward autumn. Yet despite these gentler changes, the calm that seemed to arrive with the cooler nights did not linger long. Instead, it ushered in a new and unexpected challenge, one that tested both the estate's operations and the fragile balance that had been carefully restored after months of tension. It began with a storm, not the usual summer shower, but a long, heavy rain, accompanied by powerful winds that swept across the slopes and down into the valleys. For 2 days, the estate endured unbroken rainfall, turning pathways into narrow streams and saturating the earth beneath the great trees that bordered the gardens. The storm revealed vulnerabilities that had gone unnoticed during the dry heat of summer. Roof tiles loosened where wind had pried at them. Small leaks appeared in attic spaces that were rarely used, and water seeped through older sections of stone walls that had weathered decades of mountain storms. When the rain finally subsided, the groundskeepers and maintenance staff faced an overwhelming list of repairs. The storm itself might have passed into quiet memory had it not been for the incident that unfolded early on the third morning, when one of the estate's large retaining walls, weakened by the saturation of the soil, gave way along a slope near the stables. The collapse occurred before dawn, and though no workers were present at the moment, the sound echoed across the nearby fields with such force that it awakened several of the stable hands sleeping in quarters nearby. When daylight revealed the damage, the scale was larger than anyone had anticipated. A section of wall had crumbled under the weight of the soaked earth, sending stones cascading down the hillside. The collapse damaged parts of the bridle path below and left a deep scar along the slope that required immediate attention. Workers were dispatched at once to assess the damage. They moved carefully around the unstable ground, marking areas that posed a risk of further collapse. The senior groundskeeper, a man who had served on the estate for many years, examined the hillside with a somber expression. He understood the implications. This was not simply a matter of replacing stones. The collapse threatened the structural integrity of the surrounding terrain, and if not addressed quickly, further erosion could occur with the next heavy rainfall. The work ahead would be extensive, demanding both skill and labor at a time when the staff was already stretched thin from the long months of summer. News of the collapse spread quickly among the servants and workers. The reaction was a mix of concern and exhaustion. Many understood the importance of the wall, especially those who worked near the stables and gardens. Others simply felt the weight of yet another demanding task added to an already full season. But despite their fatigue, the workers approached the situation with quiet determination. Biltmore had faced challenges before, and they had learned to respond with resilience. George was informed shortly after sunrise. He arrived at the site with an air of concern, accompanied by several supervisors. The sight of the collapsed wall unsettled him. He listened closely as the groundskeeper explained the damage and outlined what would be required to stabilize the slope. It was clear that the repairs would require not only immediate labor, but also a long-term plan to reinforce the area. George took in every detail, aware that the storm had exposed a weakness that had gone unnoticed for years. Edith, too, visited the site later that morning. She spoke with the workers, asking about their safety and ensuring that precautions were taken before repairs began. Her presence carried a kind of steady calm that reassured those who saw her. She had always understood that the estate's beauty depended on the care of those who maintained it. The collapse reminded her, once again, that Biltmore was not a static creation, but a living place, shaped daily by both human effort and the unpredictability of nature. The repairs began immediately. Workers cleared the fallen stones, moving them carefully down the slope to prevent further damage. Others inspected nearby sections of the wall, identifying areas weakened by the storm. The labor was slow and physically demanding. The ground remained soft and unstable, and every movement required caution. Days stretched into long hours as teams worked to stabilize the slope before the next rainfall. And though there was a sense of urgency, the work proceeded with the steady, deliberate pace that experience had taught them was necessary. During this period, a shift took place within the household staff. As the workers outdoors focused on the collapse, those inside the house adjusted their duties to lighten the burden on their colleagues. Housemaids volunteered for longer hours so that the stable hands could rest when possible. Kitchen staff prepared meals that could be delivered easily to the workers at the site. Even the butler, usually removed from the physical labor of the grounds, assisted in coordinating schedules to ensure that everyone received adequate time for rest. It was a quiet demonstration of unity, shaped not by command but by shared understanding. Despite their efforts, the collapse revealed deeper truths about the estate. The magnitude of Biltmore's operations meant that even small vulnerabilities could escalate into significant challenges. Nature did not grant exceptions for vision or wealth. The hillside did not distinguish between the grandeur of the estate and the simple fact that water and earth obeyed their own laws. And the workers, though dedicated and resilient, could only manage so much before reaching the limits of their endurance. As the days passed, the repair work gradually took shape. The slope was stabilized, new stones were cut to replace those that had shattered, and the retaining wall began to rise once more. The workers moved with a quiet rhythm, their steady progress forming a kind of silent reassurance that the estate's grandeur would endure. Yet even as the wall neared completion, a lingering sense of vulnerability remained. The storm had served as a reminder that nothing at Biltmore was ever permanently secure, not in the face of the natural world, nor in the face of the continuous demands placed upon the people who kept it functioning. One evening, near the end of the repairs, the workers paused briefly to look over the hillside as the setting sun cast golden light across the newly rebuilt stones. The scene was peaceful, calm, and deceptively stable. They stood in silence, knowing that their work had restored the slope for now, but also understanding that future storms would one day test it again. Biltmore, for all its beauty, required constant vigilance. As the last of the workers left the site for the day, the night sounds slowly returned. The crickets resumed their steady chorus, their familiar rhythm filling the quiet spaces between the rustling leaves and the distant echo of footsteps returning to the servants' quarters. It was in this gentle blend of night sounds that the estate transitioned once more, preparing itself for autumn, for change, and for challenges that lay quietly ahead. The gentle blend of night sounds that returned after the repairs, the crickets, the rustle of leaves, the faint echo of steps heading back toward the servant quarters, became the quiet thread carrying the estate toward the early days of autumn. That familiar chorus had accompanied Biltmore through many seasons, yet as summer faded, its tone seemed to shift subtly, as if announcing the approach of something quieter, steadier, and tinged with reflection. The workers who walked back toward their modest rooms each evening heard in that chorus a welcome sense of closure after long days of repairing what the storm had taken. But as with many things at Biltmore, one moment of calm often revealed deeper movements below the surface. The transition into autumn brought with it not only cooler air, but also a change in the very rhythm of the estate, drawing everyone into a period of careful preparation and unspoken anticipation. Autumn arrived first in the high branches of the surrounding forests. The green softened, then deepened, before giving way to the earliest hints of gold. Mornings grew crisp, with a light mist drifting through the valleys before lifting to reveal clear skies. The workers welcomed the gentler temperatures after months of demanding heat. Their steps grew lighter, their voices carried more easily through the halls and across the grounds, and the estate took on a calmer, steadier energy. It was a season of balance, one that allowed the workers to regain strength while still attending to the constant demands of the vast property. Inside the house, the shift toward autumn created new responsibilities. Large windows, opened frequently during summer, were now closed early in the mornings to keep the chill out. Carpets rolled up during warm months were unrolled again, their weight and texture adding warmth to the stone floors. Seasonal furnishings were moved into place, heavy draperies were brushed and rehung, and the servants continued their long cycle of maintaining rooms that visitors rarely saw. These seasonal tasks required precision and care, not because they would be inspected by guests, but because they maintained the dignity of the estate itself. Even hidden spaces needed to be tended with the same respect as the grand rooms. In the gardens and grounds, the arrival of autumn meant another round of demanding work. The groundskeepers inspected delicate plants that needed protection before the first frost. They raked leaves along paths where guests walked daily, cleared branches that had fallen from the storm-weakened trees, and prepared the meadows for the quieter months to come. Autumn also brought increased attention to the estate's agricultural areas. Harvesting took place on expansive plots, storing crops that would support both the estate and nearby communities. The workers moved steadily through these routines, grateful for the cool air that eased their hours outdoors. Though the estate was calmer than it had been during summer, the memory of the recent retaining wall collapse lingered. The workers could not fully shake the realization that nature could disrupt their efforts without warning. A single storm had tested their endurance, and while they had rebuilt what had been damaged, they knew that future seasons would bring new challenges. This awareness gave their work a sense of quiet gravity. Each task, no matter how routine, was tied to the larger stability of the estate. And in that awareness, the workers found a form of shared purpose that softened the strains of the past months. George and Edith, too, felt the shift in season deeply. After months focused on repairs and staffing challenges, they now found themselves walking the estate more often, observing the land with the reflective calm that autumn often brings. George lingered along the tree-lined paths, taking in the changing leaves. He seemed quieter, more contemplative, as if the storm and the repairs had reminded him once again that even his vast resources could not fully control the forces that shaped his estate. Edith watched the workers with her usual attentiveness, noticing the signs of fatigue now replaced with steadier movements. She spoke with staff as she passed them outdoors, offering a sense of presence that reassured those who still carried the strain of summer. Yet even in this gentle season, a new undercurrent began to flow quietly through the estate. It was not rooted in conflict, nor born from sudden change. Instead, it came from a more subtle shift, a recognition among the servants that Biltmore was evolving, growing more complex with each passing year. The estate now demanded not only physical labor, but also adaptability, resilience, and the ability to respond to unexpected challenges. The servants felt this shift even if they did not express it directly. Their conversations, held softly in corridors or whispered near workstations, reflected an increased awareness of their importance in maintaining the estate's stability. One early autumn morning, as mist clung to the ridges, a group of gardeners gathered near the walled garden to discuss their responsibilities for the coming weeks. The head gardener outlined the sequence of tasks with practiced clarity: preparing soil for winter, relocating delicate plants to sheltered greenhouses, and assessing which areas might need reinforcement before the first frost. The workers listened carefully, aware that each decision would influence how the gardens emerged the following year. Their sense of responsibility was both practical and deeply personal. The gardens were not simply parts of the estate. They were living expressions of shared effort and quiet pride. Inside the house, similar preparations unfolded. In storerooms behind the grand hallways, linens were inspected, stored, or replaced. Seasonal dishes were polished and returned to dining rooms rarely used outside of formal gatherings. Footmen practiced lifting heavier trays once again, anticipating upcoming events that would bring new sets of guests. Even those who worked in the least visible roles, laundry workers, scullery staff, and maintenance teams, felt the shift. The rhythm of autumn was gentler than summer's demands, yet it brought a different kind of workload requiring steady endurance. As the weeks passed, the estate settled into these routines with a sense of returning equilibrium. The quiet nights, filled now with the softer chorus of insects preparing for colder weather, offered a gentle backdrop to the workers' renewed sense of calm. The crickets no longer sang with the intensity they had in the height of summer. Their voices had softened, becoming a fading echo of the season that was slowly passing. And yet that subdued sound served as a reminder that the estate, like the surrounding land, existed in continuous cycles, each stage flowing into the next, each challenge giving way to new responsibilities, each moment of stillness preparing the workers for what lay ahead. One evening, near the end of the harvest season, the workers gathered briefly outside to take in the sight of the mountains as they shifted from green to gold and finally toward a deeper rust. The air carried a crispness that hinted at the colder months soon to come. They stood quietly, each recognizing the familiar sense of transition. Autumn had offered them a season of steadier rhythms, a time to recover and restore order after the strains of summer and the storm. But as the wind grew cooler and the sky darkened earlier each day, they understood that the estate was once again on the verge of change. For now, though, the fading song of crickets lingered just long enough to guide them into the next chapter, carrying with it the quiet promise of peaceful nights and the steady assurance that the land, in its constant transformation, would continue to shape their days in ways both familiar and profoundly human. The fading song of crickets that guided the estate into the next chapter hovered delicately in the background of early evenings, diminishing day by day as the air sharpened and the first hints of frost touched the shadows beneath the trees. As their gentle rhythm softened into a distant whisper, the estate began its gradual shift toward winter. The workers felt the change not only in the cooler air, but also in the rhythm of their routines, which took on a steadier and more deliberate pace. The quiet retreat of those familiar night sounds became a reminder that the busiest seasons had passed and a new period of preparation had begun, one that was quieter, yes, but no less demanding in its own way. Winter at Biltmore approached slowly, marked first by the lengthening shadows that stretched across the lawns each afternoon. The sun dipped earlier behind the ridges, casting a muted glow over the rolling landscape. The forests, once full of vibrant foliage, now stood bare and revealed their intricate shapes against the pale sky. The estate's workers, accustomed to the unpredictable rhythm of the summer months and the renewed balance of autumn, now adjusted once more to tasks designed to steady the estate through colder days and long nights. The approach of winter required preparation at every corner of the estate. The groundskeepers shifted from harvesting and pruning to protecting. Delicate shrubs near the terraces were wrapped carefully in burlap to shield them from frost. Fountains were drained and cleaned, their stillness a stark contrast to the lively flow of warmer months. Pathways were inspected, cleared, and repaired before the arrival of freezing temperatures, ensuring that winter's ice would not further erode the surfaces that guests and workers relied upon every day. Inside the house, a different cycle began. Fires were lit earlier each afternoon, their warmth spreading through the grand rooms and easing the cool draft that crept in from the stone walls. The housemaids moved carefully through the hallways, polishing brass fixtures dulled by months of use, refreshing linens stored away during the warmer seasons, and ensuring that each room remained as peaceful and inviting as the estate's reputation promised. The kitchens, though less frantic than during summer gatherings, buzzed with a quieter but steady energy. Meals shifted toward warmer dishes, requiring more preparation and more careful tending of simmering pots. Beyond these seasonal tasks, winter brought a sense of introspection to the estate. The workers who spent so much of the year responding to the urgent needs of the season now found themselves with moments of quiet that allowed them to reflect on the past months. For many, those reflections carried a sense of gratitude for the steady changes introduced to improve their working conditions. Others found themselves thinking about their families, their futures, and the paths that had brought them to Biltmore. The estate was not simply a place of labor. It was a place where lives were shaped by the rhythm of the year, and these quieter months allowed space for personal thoughts to emerge. George and Edith, too, embraced this reflective season. They spent more time walking through the house, observing its details with an attentiveness that seemed heightened during winter. George often paused near the large windows that overlooked the estate's hills, contemplating both the beauty of the landscape and the challenges that had marked the year. He felt the weight of responsibility more clearly during these colder months, perhaps because winter stripped away some of the estate's distractions, leaving behind only its essential truths. Edith, moving gently through the rooms, continued to offer guidance to the staff and ensured that their voices remained heard. She understood that winter was a time when burdens could feel heavier, and her presence served as a quiet anchor during the long season. The workers' routines shifted not only in pace but also in purpose. Maintenance tasks that had been too difficult during the busy months were finally addressed. Loose floorboards in the service corridors were repaired. Cracked tiles near lesser-used entrances were carefully replaced. Cloth hangings stored away during the summer were inspected and mended. These tasks, while seemingly small, held deep significance for the workers. They contributed to the lasting life of the estate, and in their steady hands, Biltmore continued to endure through the passing of seasons. In some ways, winter brought the staff closer together. The shorter days meant more time spent indoors, more shared meals in the servants' hall, and more quiet conversations during rest breaks. They discussed the storms of the past year, the repairs, the long summer that had tested their endurance, and the moments of unity that had helped them through it all. They also spoke of their hopes for the coming year, hopes for continued improvements, for moments of rest, for more steadiness and fewer challenges. The bonds formed during these conversations were subtle but strong, rooted in shared responsibility and mutual respect. Yet winter was not without its difficulties. The cold seeped into the servants' quarters, even with improvements made earlier in the year. The early mornings were particularly challenging as workers rose before dawn and walked through chilly corridors to begin their tasks. For those assigned to outdoor work, the frost-covered ground made each step deliberate and slow. Still, they approached their responsibilities with the same diligence that had carried them through every other season. They understood the importance of their work and the fragile balance that kept the estate functioning. As Christmas approached, the estate transformed once more. Decorations were carefully unpacked and placed throughout the house. Wreaths adorned the grand entrance, garlands were draped along staircases, and candles glowed softly in rooms that had remained dim for much of the season. The servants who prepared these decorations did so with a sense of pride. They knew the sight of a fully adorned Biltmore brought comfort not only to guests, but to the estate's residents as well. The warmth of the season offered a moment of harmony, a brief reprieve from the responsibilities that would continue into the next year. Christmas Day at Biltmore was quieter than many imagined. It was a day marked by calm movements, soft voices, and unspoken appreciation. The workers who had families nearby were given shortened shifts, allowing them time to return home. Others stayed on site, sharing a modest holiday meal in the servants' hall. The atmosphere held a rare sense of stillness, as if the estate itself paused for a moment to reflect on the passing year. In the days that followed, winter settled more firmly over the estate. Snow fell for the first time in a gentle sheet, covering the grounds in a light blanket that softened every edge. The crickets, whose fading song had carried the estate into this season, were now silent. In their place, the quiet hush of winter took hold, a silence that was neither empty nor cold, but contemplative and steady. As workers stepped outside to clear pathways or tend to animals, their breath rose in faint clouds that dissolved into the still air. They moved with care, knowing that each season carried its own set of challenges. Yet in this silence, there was also peace. The estate had endured storms, heat, collapse, and strain. Now, wrapped in winter's gentle quiet, it prepared itself for the next chapter, holding within its walls the stories of those who sustained it day after day. And as snow continued to fall softly over the distant hills, the estate waited, listening to the silence that winter always brought, an unbroken pause before the next cycle began. The silence that winter always brought, the unbroken pause after months of movement, labor, and strain, lingered over the estate as the new year approached. Snow rested quietly along the rooftops and softened the wide lawns into gentle slopes of white. The stillness was deeper than at any other time of year, as though the land itself held its breath, gathering strength before the thaw. Yet within that silence lay an undercurrent of expectation, a sense that the estate and the people who sustained it were waiting for something unseen. That pause, so delicate and so complete, opened the way to a season that would reveal more about Biltmore's inner workings than many realized. As January settled firmly over the mountains, the estate found its rhythm in the slow, deliberate routines shaped by cold weather. The workers rose long before dawn, bundling themselves in layers as they stepped through dim hallways that still carried the chill of night. The sound of their footsteps, soft against the stone floors, echoed faintly in the stillness. Outside, frost clung to the windows, leaving delicate patterns that caught the first light of morning. The air was crisp, carrying the clarity of winter that made every sound, every closing door, every distant call across the grounds seem sharper. Inside the mansion, fires were tended with great care. The warmth they provided was essential, especially in the larger rooms where the stone walls held the cold. Housemaids stoked the flames early, ensuring that the family awoke to gentle heat rather than the bite of winter air. The servants worked quietly, aware that the stillness of the season demanded a gentler touch. They moved in steady rhythms, preserving a calm atmosphere that matched the land outside. But beneath the calm, winter brought a different kind of strain. Though the estate appeared peaceful, the reduced staff numbers typical of the season meant assignments multiplied for those who remained. One maid now handled the duties usually shared by two. A single footman often carried responsibilities that would have been divided among several during the busier months. The winter workload, though different from summer's intensity, carried its own weight. The staff approached these tasks with the resilience that had guided them through previous seasons, but the quiet of winter made each responsibility feel heavier, its importance magnified by the stillness surrounding them. The groundskeepers faced even greater challenges. Snowfall, though beautiful, created constant work. Paths needed clearing each morning, both for the family and for the workers navigating the grounds. Livestock required extra care to ensure they remained warm and well fed. Greenhouses, essential for preserving delicate plants through the season, had to be monitored constantly. A single lapse, a freezing night without proper ventilation adjustments, could undo months of careful cultivation. The workers who tended these spaces understood the stakes, and their vigilance became its own form of winter endurance. Yet winter also brought moments of welcome quiet. On clear mornings, the sunrise cast a golden glow across the snowy fields, illuminating the rolling hills in a soft light that seemed almost otherworldly. Workers paused briefly during their early tasks, taking in the sight of the untouched snow stretching across the estate. These brief moments offered a sense of peace, a reminder that despite the challenges, the land still held beauty capable of lifting the spirit. George and Edith felt the quiet of the season as well. Winter offered them rare hours of stillness, free from guests, construction plans, or pressing seasonal demands. George spent more time in his library, surrounded by books he rarely had the opportunity to read during busier months. He studied works on art, architecture, and agriculture, subjects that continued to shape his vision for the estate. Yet winter's quiet also brought an undeniable reminder of the scale of that vision. Maintaining the estate during this dormant season revealed the true cost, the constant effort required simply to preserve what existed. Edith, meanwhile, devoted more time to the well-being of the staff. She knew the winter months tested the endurance of those who worked largely unseen. She visited the servants' hall more often, speaking gently with workers about their needs. She ensured that warm clothing was distributed to those working outdoors and quietly arranged for extra food to be provided during the coldest weeks. Her attentiveness did not remove the hardships of winter, but it strengthened the sense of unity that had grown within the estate. Workers felt her presence not as an authority, but as a steady support, one that eased the weight of the season. Despite these efforts, winter's quiet also brought introspection that could be unsettling. With fewer distractions, workers found themselves reflecting on their lives with unusual clarity. Some wondered how many more seasons they would spend at the estate. Others considered paths they might take elsewhere, decisions shaped by family needs or personal hopes. These thoughts remained unspoken, yet they moved quietly through the workers' minds like a low wind through bare branches. Such reflections did not stem from discontent alone, but from the natural pause winter brought, a moment when the future felt close enough to consider honestly. This introspective atmosphere extended beyond the servants' quarters. George, too, spent long hours contemplating the estate's future. The cost of maintaining the vast property weighed heavily on him, especially during winter, when expenses increased while income from guests diminished. He loved the estate deeply, saw it as both a personal achievement and a contribution to the region. Yet he understood that its long-term success depended on careful planning and constant adaptation. Winter sharpened these concerns, bringing them forward with a clarity that demanded attention. By February, the estate entered the deepest part of the season. Snowfall became less frequent but more severe when it came, blanketing the grounds in thicker layers that took days to clear. Ice formed along shaded pathways, requiring constant monitoring to prevent accidents. The darker mornings and early sunsets cast a somber quiet across the land, a quiet that extended into the stone halls of the mansion. Yet the workers continued their routines with steady determination, guided by the knowledge that winter, like every season, would pass. One evening, as the workers finished clearing the last of the day's snowfall, they paused at the edge of the grounds. The sky was a deep, velvety blue, and stars shone clearly through the cold air. The estate lay behind them, its windows glowing warmly against the night. In that moment, the silence felt almost complete, broken only by their soft footsteps and the distant sound of wind moving through bare branches. It was in this quiet, this deep winter stillness, that the first signs of change began to emerge. The workers could not yet name it, and neither could the family, but something in the air felt subtly different, like the faintest shift beneath the surface, preparing the land and its people for the transformations that would soon follow. And as the wind carried its hush across the snow-covered hills, the estate waited, poised at the edge of winter's deepest silence, ready for the first hint of the coming thaw. The estate, poised at the edge of winter's deepest silence, stood quietly through the final weeks of the season, as though listening for the first soft signal of change. That silence, so complete and so rare, was both a comfort and a reminder. It revealed every sound with heightened clarity: the faint crackle of ice loosening from branches, the distant call of a single bird testing the cold air, the muted thud of workers' boots as they crossed the frozen ground. And then, one morning, almost imperceptibly at first, that silence shifted. Somewhere beyond the forests that bordered the estate, a slow thaw began, loosening the grip of winter and sending the first subtle hints of early spring across the land. It was a transition felt rather than seen, a quiet stirring beneath the surface that would open the next chapter in Biltmore's unfolding story. As February gave way to early March, the workers noticed the change before the landscape fully revealed it. The air, though still cold, carried a softness that had been absent for months. The ground, once frozen solid, yielded slightly beneath each footstep, leaving faint impressions in the thinning snow. The soundscape shifted too. The deep winter hush, so heavy and encompassing, gave way to small sounds: water dripping from rooftops, the gentle rush of meltwater gathering along the edges of paths, the rustling of animals emerging cautiously from winter shelter. These changes were small, but within the estate they signaled a transformation already felt in the workers' pace and demeanor. The thaw brought both relief and new responsibility. Winter's tasks required steady endurance, but spring demanded movement, assessment, and preparation. The groundskeepers were among the first to return to an active rhythm. They walked the pathways daily, observing areas where ice had weakened stone or where tree branches needed to be cleared to prevent hazards. They inspected the gardens, noting where frost had damaged the soil or where protective coverings needed to be loosened before the first new shoots appeared. Winter had been gentle in some respects, but it had left subtle traces across the estate that required careful attention. In the stables, the thaw meant new routines as well. Horses that had spent much of the winter indoors now needed gradual reintroduction to the outdoor paths. Stable hands worked patiently, walking them through softened ground that could be unpredictable beneath their hooves. The presence of meltwater required vigilance to avoid small rivulets that could start grooves in the soil. The workers moved with practiced ease, aware that spring's earliest days always carried a delicate balance between renewed energy and hidden risks. Inside the house, the shift was more gradual but no less significant. Though fires continued to burn in the grand rooms, the housemaids opened windows slightly during the warmer afternoons to air out spaces closed tightly through the winter months. The faint scent of fresh air drifted into the hallways, mingling with the lingering aroma of wood smoke and polished wood. It was a small but meaningful change, a signal that the house itself was preparing to emerge from its winter stillness. Spring also brought renewed attention to the estate's ongoing improvements. The aftermath of the storm and the retaining wall collapse remained fresh in the minds of the workers and the family. As the thaw revealed the contours of the land more clearly, George and the senior groundskeeper walked the slopes to evaluate the repaired areas. They studied the hillside carefully, assessing how well the new stones held after months of cold and snow. The wall had stood firm, but the experience had left a deeper awareness of the estate's vulnerabilities. Plans were discussed for reinforcing adjacent areas to reduce the risk of future collapses. And though the work would take time, the preparations reflected a growing commitment to long-term stability. The thaw also carried an emotional shift for the workers. After the introspective stillness of winter, the promise of spring offered something more hopeful. Conversations in the servants' hall grew livelier. Workers who had spent the winter months quietly focused on routine tasks now spoke of the coming season with renewed energy. They discussed the vegetables they hoped to grow in small personal plots outside their quarters, the possibility of visiting family on upcoming rest days, and the simple pleasure of working outdoors in mild weather. The atmosphere softened, warmed by both the changing air and the shared anticipation of brighter days. Still, the transition to spring was not without its challenges. The meltwater that softened the ground also made certain areas of the estate treacherous. Slopes became slick and paths became muddy. Workers had to adjust their routines, moving more slowly in areas where footing was uncertain. The estate's animals required special care during this period of fluctuating temperatures. Delicate plants in the greenhouses needed careful monitoring to ensure they were not exposed prematurely to the still cold nights. These tasks required attentiveness and patience, but the workers approached them with a steadiness shaped by years of managing such transitional periods. For George and Edith, early spring was a time of planning. They met frequently with staff leaders to discuss upcoming events, maintenance schedules, and improvements. Edith focused on matters that would ensure the workers' well-being as their routines shifted from indoor to outdoor labor. She checked on the condition of their quarters, noting where adjustments might be needed after the cold had stretched the building's materials. George, meanwhile, revisited long-term plans for the estate's agricultural areas and forestry projects. Spring offered an opportunity to begin new initiatives, and he wanted to ensure that they aligned with both his vision and the practical realities experienced by the workers who carried out the daily labor. One afternoon, as the first true warmth of the season settled over the landscape, a group of gardeners gathered near the walled garden to begin removing winter coverings. As they lifted the burlap and straw that had protected delicate shrubs through the cold months, they discovered the earliest signs of life, small green shoots pushing through the soil, tentative yet determined. The workers paused briefly, taking in the quiet miracle of new growth. These first sprouts, modest as they were, symbolized resilience and renewal. They represented not only the return of spring, but the enduring spirit of those who tended the estate, season after season, year after year. By late March, the thaw had fully taken hold. The forests surrounding the estate began to stir with the faintest hints of color, the beginnings of buds that would soon cover the hillsides in soft shades of green. Birds returned in greater numbers, their calls layering over the landscape and replacing winter's silence with a gentle melody. Water moved freely through the streams, carrying away the last remnants of melted snow. And as the estate embraced this transformation, the workers felt the shift not only in the tasks they performed, but in the renewed sense of purpose that spring inevitably brought. They understood, as they always had, that each season demanded something different from them. Yet spring, with its promise of growth, offered a sense of forward movement that winter could not. It encouraged resilience, inspired hope, and reminded them that despite the challenges of the previous year, the estate continued to breathe, evolve, and endure. As the sun set on one of the first truly warm days, the sound of flowing water, steady, clear, and full of life, carried through the grounds. It filled the quiet spaces left by winter's retreat, guiding the estate gently into a new season that would bring its own trials and triumphs, shaped by the familiar rhythm that connected land, labor, and the passing of time. The steady sound of flowing water that carried the estate into a new season lingered long after the last traces of snow had vanished. It moved through the quiet ravines and along the small channels that bordered the gardens, creating a soft, continuous murmur. That sound, so gentle and steady, became the new backdrop to daily life at Biltmore. And yet, as peaceful as it seemed, it also marked the beginning of another cycle of labor, expectation, and quiet endurance. Spring, with all its promise, brought a kind of momentum that touched every corner of the estate. Life quickened, tasks multiplied, and the workers who had found brief stillness in winter now prepared themselves for the demands that would follow. The arrival of spring at Biltmore was never abrupt. Instead, it revealed itself gradually, in details small enough to miss, unless one observed with care. The trees along the ridges softened into faint shades of green, like a watercolor wash spreading across the mountains. The meadows, flattened and pale through winter, began to lift toward the sun with early shoots of grass. Birds reappeared in greater numbers each morning, their songs interwoven with the steady hum of meltwater that coursed through the estate. These small changes brought a sense of renewal, but they also signaled the return of a demanding rhythm familiar to all who worked the land. For the gardeners, spring was both the most anticipated and the most challenging season. The first warm days triggered a wave of tasks that required immediate attention. Beds needed to be cleared of winter debris, soil turned and enriched, and early plantings begun before the growing season accelerated. The greenhouse workers moved steadily through aisles of delicate seedlings, preparing each tray for transplanting. Outside, teams gathered along the walled garden, planning the placement of seasonal blooms with precision that reflected years of disciplined practice. These tasks demanded concentration and endurance, yet many workers approached them with a quiet sense of joy. Spring work, though heavy, carried a reward visible in every leaf, every bloom, every revived space. The estate's agricultural areas also came alive with renewed purpose. Workers examined fields that had rested during winter, testing soil conditions and preparing for the planting of crops. Farmhands repaired equipment, reinforced fencing weakened by snow, and cleaned storage areas that would soon overflow with produce. The orchards demanded special attention. Trees pruned in winter now revealed signs of budding, and workers moved carefully among them, inspecting branches for damage and setting protective measures against late frosts. These tasks, though often unseen by the estate's visitors, form the backbone of Biltmore's self-sustaining operations. Inside the house, spring brought another layer of transformation. Heavy winter draperies were replaced with lighter fabrics, their colors reflecting the fresh tones emerging in the gardens. Windows were opened wider now, allowing sunlight to warm the hallways and fresh air to circulate through rooms that had been closed tightly during the colder months. The housemaids polished surfaces dulled by winter use, refreshed linens stored away since autumn, and prepared guest rooms for the increase in visitors that typically arrived with warmer weather. Their tasks multiplied each week, yet their movements retained the same quiet discipline that had shaped the estate's daily life from its earliest days. The butler and footman, too, prepared for the seasonal shift. Spring brought more gatherings, more dinners that required elaborate preparation, and more attention to detail. The demands of service increased, but the footmen approached their responsibilities with practiced composure. They reviewed routines, polished silver, and prepared dining spaces with a care that upheld the estate's reputation for hospitality. In the midst of this growing activity, the flow of water outside, the streams gradually strengthening as spring storms fed them, seemed to echo the rising movement within the house. George and Edith watched these transformations with a shared sense of purpose. George, inspired by the land's renewal, returned to long-term plans that winter had placed on hold. He walked through the agricultural fields with staff leaders, discussing crop rotations, new irrigation methods, and adjustments needed after the winter storms. He visited the forests, examining areas affected by the retaining wall collapse, and spoke with foresters about soil reinforcement and long-term conservation. His vision for the estate remained expansive, yet spring reminded him that such a vision required constant recalibration. Nature moved at its own pace, and the estate's success depended on understanding and respecting that rhythm. Edith focused her attention on the people who sustained the estate. She met regularly with department heads to discuss workloads and ensure that no group was overwhelmed by the rapid increase in tasks. She noted areas where additional support might be needed and quietly arranged for temporary workers during the busiest weeks. Her sensitivity to the staff's well-being had deepened over the past year, shaped by seasons of strain and the lingering memory of the near walkout. She understood, perhaps more clearly than ever, that the estate's beauty depended not only on planning and resources, but on the steady, often invisible labor of those who tended every corner of its vast property. Despite the renewed sense of energy spring brought, the season also revealed lingering vulnerabilities. The thaw had softened some areas of ground more than expected, causing certain paths to erode quickly under increased foot traffic. Workers moved swiftly to address these issues, but the ease with which the land shifted underscored the estate's dependence on continuous maintenance. Small cracks appeared in plaster along some interior walls as the building adjusted to the temperature changes. Though minor, these signs reminded everyone that even monumental structures responded to the natural world in subtle, unavoidable ways. As April progressed, the estate grew more vibrant. Blossoms emerged in waves, first the pale blooms of dogwood and redbud along the forest edges, then the more deliberate unfolding of roses and garden flowers carefully arranged by the gardeners. Bees returned to the estate's hives, their soft hum adding another layer to the growing symphony of spring sounds. The steady flow of water, now clearer and more purposeful than during the early thaw, wove through all these changes. It carried with it the memory of winter, the promise of growth, and the silent strength that moved through the land long before the estate existed. For the workers, the season brought a mix of satisfaction and fatigue. The long months of preparation had culminated in this moment, when the estate seemed to breathe again after winter's retreat. Yet the tasks were far from complete. There were fields still to plant, gardens still to shape, rooms still to refresh. They approached each task with resilience shaped by experiences of the past year. Storms weathered, challenges endured, seasons carried through with unity. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridges and cast long shadows over the meadows, a group of workers paused along one of the estate's small bridges. Beneath them, the water moved steadily, clearer now than it had been in months. They listened to its gentle sound, a quiet reminder of how each season connected to the next, how their work flowed through the estate in ways not unlike the water beneath their feet. The moment was brief, but it held a sense of continuity, an understanding that spring's renewal was not only for the land, but for those who shaped it through their steady hands and enduring spirit. As they returned to their quarters, the sound of the flowing water lingered, guiding the estate once more into the unfolding chapters of a year defined by resilience, labor, and the timeless rhythm of the seasons. The sound of flowing water that lingered beneath the small bridge stayed with the workers long after they returned to their quarters that evening. It moved gently through the estate, like a quiet reminder of everything the land had endured and everything it continued to offer. As the days grew longer and spring deepened, that steady current guided the estate into a season that brought not only renewal, but also a sharpening sense of clarity. The flowing water had softened winter's silence. Now it ushered in a moment of honest reflection, one that touched workers, family members, and the very land that sustained them. Late spring at Biltmore was a time of remarkable beauty. The hillsides shifted fully into green. The gardens bloomed in rich layers, and the soft warmth of the season made the estate appear almost effortless in its grandeur. But beneath that surface lay the truth that had shaped every chapter of the estate's history. None of its beauty existed without cost. The workers felt this truth acutely, for the increase in tasks that accompanied the season demanded near constant attention. The gardens alone required daily care to maintain their precision. The agricultural fields needed vigilance to protect early plantings from pests and sudden temperature drops. The house demanded thoroughness and speed as guests arrived more frequently. In these increasing demands, the workers found themselves thinking more often about the history of the land on which they labored. They knew, as did many in the region, that the land had once been home to families, farms, and lives that had shaped the mountains long before the estate was imagined. Some workers shared memories passed down from grandparents and great-grandparents, stories of people who had been moved from their homes when the estate was constructed, often with little choice and few resources. These memories were rarely spoken openly, not from fear, but from a quiet respect for the weight they carried. Yet during spring's reflective moments, especially those spent outdoors, they surfaced softly in the minds of those whose families had long histories in the region. Some evenings, as workers walked back toward the servant quarters, they passed areas where old foundations still lay hidden beneath the undergrowth. These remnants, barely visible to those unfamiliar with the land, stood as silent markers of earlier lives. A few workers paused near them, acknowledging the history without speaking it aloud. It was a private understanding, one that added depth to their connection with the estate, but also a sense of responsibility to honor what had come before. George and Edith were not unaware of this history. They had both learned over time that the establishment of the estate had changed the region in profound ways. George often reflected on the promises he had made to himself about stewardship, growth, and responsibility. The estate was meant to be more than a display of wealth. It was meant to be a place that supported the community, preserved the land, and offered employment and resources. Yet he could not ignore that its creation had required sacrifices from families who once lived on land that now belonged to Biltmore. Spring in its clarity made those reflections sharper. To address these concerns, George had spent the early months of the year expanding programs that offered agricultural education to local farmers, sharing expertise and resources that could support their livelihoods. He believed that Biltmore's purpose extended beyond its boundaries, that its prosperity must also uplift the surrounding communities. Edith, equally committed to this vision, worked closely with local women to support households that struggled during seasonal downturns. These efforts were not a perfect remedy, nor could they erase the past, but they reflected a sincere attempt to create a more balanced legacy. The workers observed these efforts with mixed feelings. Some felt deep gratitude. Others remained quietly aware that the estate's existence carried complexities that could not be simplified. Yet among them, a steady truth prevailed. They knew their labor contributed to something larger than themselves. Whether they agreed with every decision made by the estate or not, they recognized the unique role they played in its daily life and its long-term vision. As spring reached its full height, new challenges emerged. One was a sudden influx of visitors who arrived earlier than expected, drawn by the season's beauty and the estate's growing reputation. Their presence strained the household staff, who had begun preparations but had not anticipated so many visitors so soon. Housemaids rushed to refresh rooms, footmen balanced increased service demands, and kitchen workers found themselves preparing far more meals than usual. The pressure tested the fragile equilibrium the estate had achieved. Yet something remarkable occurred during these weeks of unexpected strain. The workers, those who cleaned the rooms, prepared the meals, tended the gardens, and maintained the grounds, responded with a unity that revealed how deeply the previous year had shaped them. They communicated more effectively, adjusted their routines with practiced flexibility, and stepped in to support one another without waiting for instruction. The near walkout of the past, the storm, the retaining wall collapse, and the long winter reflection had forged a shared resilience. They no longer worked simply side by side. They worked with an understanding that each role, each effort, held meaning for the whole. George noticed this shift. He appreciated that the estate's survival depended not only on planning and resources, but on the quiet strength of the people who carried out its daily operations. He began inviting department leaders to more frequent meetings, asking for their input on staffing, equipment, and scheduling. He sought their insights with sincerity, understanding that true leadership required listening. Edith continued her efforts to support staff well-being, ensuring time for rest, arranging seasonal accommodations, and addressing concerns before they became burdens. Meanwhile, the land itself reflected the balance between beauty and labor. The gardens glowed with color, but every bloom represented countless hours of planting, pruning, watering, and tending. The fields flourished, but only because of vigilant care. Even the estate's architectural details, the polished banisters, the immaculate floors, the dustless shelves, existed because someone had dedicated time and effort to maintaining them. The estate's splendor, admired by many, held within it the unseen histories and unspoken sacrifices of those who sustained it. There were evenings during this bustling season when workers ended their shifts utterly exhausted. Yet even then, many paused outside the house before heading to their quarters. They took in the sight of the estate in the soft light of dusk, its windows glowing warmly, its gardens resting quietly after a full day. They listened to the flowing water that had become the season's constant companion. In that moment, fatigue mixed with something gentler, a recognition that their labor shaped this beauty, that the estate existed not in spite of them, but because of them. As spring edged toward summer, the sound of the flowing water remained steady, guiding the estate through a moment of openness and reflection. It carried with it the truth of what had been built, the memories of what had been lost, and the quiet resilience of those who kept the estate alive, season after season, year after year. And as the water continued its quiet journey across the land, the estate prepared once more for the rising heat of summer, ready to face the next chapter shaped by labor, memory, and the enduring human stories woven into its soil.